Chapter 445. Ever since he became a student of the second floor of the academy, Ning-Kei rarely went to the front yard. That was because it was awkward to interact with his former classmates. However, he was in a hurry to report the situation and solve the problem. He also remembered that it was late and the students in the front yard were in class, so he did not go through the side door. Instead, he brought Sang-Sang to the meadow, passed the stone sign, and entered through the main door. The rain stopped and the sun shone brightly. There was the sound of reading coming from one study room, and the sound of debate coming from another study room. The front yard of the academy was enveloped in a peaceful atmosphere. At this moment, an old voice came from classroom 3. The most basic and primitive is the most important. If you can't even understand a straight line, how can you understand the more difficult three-dimensional composition? What is a straight line? A straight line is an infinite straight line. Let me show you. After a while, a female professor wearing a blue gown walked out of classroom 3 with a piece of chalk in her hand. She looked serious and seemed to be drawing a straight line in the air. There was no end to the straight line. The female professor kept drawing with the chalk in her hand. Her footsteps were slow, calm, and persistent. Soon, she left classroom 3 and walked towards the instructor's lounge at the back of the academy. Seeing this, Ning-Kei was dumbfounded. He patted Sang-Sang's shoulder and led her to the lounge behind the female professor, forgetting why he had come to the academy. In order to visit Prince Longqing and Chong and Chao Jifeng, the associate professor of etiquette, used the excuse that the qi of heaven and earth had changed and it was not suitable for classes. At that time, Ning-Kei felt that the instructors of the academy were extremely absurd. Today, this female professor who kept walking with a piece of chalk made him even more dumbfounded. Was it okay to be lazy like this? The female professor suddenly stopped outside the quiet and secluded bookstore. She put down her hand that had been stretched out in the air and carefully wrapped the chalk in a piece of paper. Then she stuffed it into her sleeve. She looked at Ning-Kei and said, "You're here?" Ning-Kei hurriedly bowed and said, "Greetings, Professor." The female professor tidied up her blue gown and said casually, "Iching is already blind. Just put him back." Ning-Kei knew that the female professor was related to the sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom. Since Chao Xiaoshu was still alive and Lu Yiqing was blind, he had already paid the price. Under such circumstances, no matter how arrogant the academy was, there was no reason for them to continue imprisoning him. If they really wanted to put Lu Bai's brother under house arrest until he was old, did they really think that the Sage of Sword had no temper? The female professor looked at him and asked, "Is there a problem?" "No problem." Ning-Kei said respectfully, "I will go to the back of the mountain to ask the teacher." The female professor said, "The headmaster wants me to ask for your opinion. Do you have any questions?" Ning-Kei was stunned and said, "I have no problem." The female professor smiled, the wrinkles on her face like flowers, and said, "Is it all right?" Ning-Kei said seriously, "I will." They followed the stone path up the cloud gate array and entered the back of the mountain of the academy. They walked around the mirror lake and looked at the waterfall. Ning-Kei bowed and said, "Yi Hongyu has come to Chong," and the only response he got was silence, as well as the wind blowing from the valley towards the thatched cottage. There was someone in the cottage, but no one was willing to talk to him. The headmaster of the academy sat in the cottage, motionless despite the wind blowing around him. His hair and beard fluttered in the wind, and he looked intoxicated like an immortal. However, what was placed in front of him was not a zither, but a messy dining table. Eldest brother and second brother sat beside the headmaster of the academy. The news that the Tao addict had left the West Hill Divine Palace and come to Cha, and did not surprise the 3 people in the cottage at all, let alone shock them. Ning-Kei thought in distress, "It seems that this can really solve the problem. However, you think it is a small matter, but for me it is a big headache." He coughed twice and said loudly again, "Ahem. She is living in my house now." Second brother looked at him coldly and said unhappily, "Can't you see that the teacher is doing something important?" Ning-Kei thought to himself, what important matter could there be in front of a table full of leftovers? It is nothing more than the headmaster of the academy bragging about his cooking skills, and you and eldest brother are flattering him. The headmaster of the academy waved to the outside of the cottage and said, "The strawberry smoothie is just about to melt. It is the most delicious time. You are lucky, come in and have a bowl." Ning-Ke was not in the mood to eat the strawberry smoothie, so he helplessly took Sang-Sang into the cottage. Second brother looked at him and sighed in his heart. He walked to the table and moved the leftovers aside. Then he half knelt down and began to divide the strawberry smoothie in the big porcelain bowl into plates. The first plate was, of course, dedicated to the great teacher, the second to the great eldest brother, and the third to the great second brother. There was not much smoothie left in the big porcelain bowl. Ning-Ke scooped it into a plate and was about to take it aside to eat. Unexpectedly, he heard the headmaster of the academy say, "Give it to the girl." Ning-Ke was startled and handed the plate of smoothie to Sang-Sang with a bitter face. Sang-Sang smiled embarrassedly and then picked up the bamboo spoon. She scooped a spoonful of smoothie and put it into her mouth. After tasting it carefully for a moment, a happy smile appeared on her slightly tanned face. Ning-Ke asked curiously, "Is it really that delicious?" Sang-Sang held the plate in one hand and the spoon in the other. She nodded seriously. Ning-Ke lowered his voice and said, "Feed me." Sang-Sang looked at the headmaster of the academy and said with her head down, "This is for me." Ning-Ke was annoyed and sneered, "Eat more if it's delicious." The headmaster of the academy was very happy to see Sang-Sang eating happily. He waved his hand and said, "Eat less even if it's delicious. Girl, the coldness in your body has not been completely dispelled. It's not good to eat too much of these cold things." Sang-Sang gently agreed and carefully picked out the strawberry pieces from the smoothie. The headmaster of the academy seemed to remember Ning-Ke's existence at this time and asked, "What did you just say?" Ning-Ke said respectfully, "The Tao addict came to Chong, and is now at my home. I don't know what happened in the West Hill Divine Palace that forced her to leave Peach Mountain." Second brother said indifferently, "Even the divine priest of light could leave West Hill. It's not hard to imagine that Yi Hongyu was forced to leave West Hill." Ning-Ke said, "But the West Hill will definitely know that she came to Chong, and what if they want her?" Second brother frowned slightly and said unhappily, "The West Hill once asked for your Sang-Sang. Did you give her to you?" Ning-Ke said, "That's different. Yi Hongyu is not my family." At this moment, eldest brother said with a gentle smile, "Since the Tao addict is also in Chong, and why not let her become a disciple like Xiaotang?" The headmaster of the academy laughed and said, "I heard that the little girl is good. Ask her if she is willing to learn from me." Ning-Ke was stunned. He did not expect that the headmaster would propose such an idea so casually. He thought of Chan Pippi's story and the time when Prince Longqing came to the second floor to take the exam as promised. He could not help but speculate that the teacher's greatest hobby in this life was to make all the genius disciples of Haotian Taoism his own students. What kind of hobby was that? Of course, Ning-Ke did not want Yi Hongyu to enter the academy. But since it was the headmaster's idea, he had no right to make any suggestions as a student. Suddenly, he thought of the headmaster of the academy talking about the cold air in Song Song's body. He suddenly realized that he had not been able to cure Song Song's old illness all these years, and had forgotten that there was such an immortal in the back of the mountain of the academy. "Headmaster, can Song Song's old illness be cured?" The headmaster of the academy looked at Sang-Sang, who was concentrating on picking strawberries, and sighed. He said, "The cold air in this girl's body is congenital and caused by the extremely cold rain. She has suffered a lot these years. Even the best doctor in the world can do nothing about it." Ning-Ke thought that Song Song's illness had decreased a lot in the past 2 years. Wasn't it self-healing? He could not help but panic and said, "Headmaster, you can't just stand by and do nothing." The headmaster of the academy said, "I don't need to do anything about it." Ning-Ke did not expect the headmaster of the academy to be so heartless. He suddenly became angry and said, "If you don't do anything, I will drop out of the school." In his anger, he was still rational. Ning-Ke could not think of any way to force the headmaster of the academy, who was admired by the whole world, other than dropping out of the school. The headmaster of the academy was even angrier when he heard this. He scolded, "Stupid guy, don't say that you are my student in the future. Haotian's divine light is the brightest and warmest thing in the world. Since this girl has learned the divine skill from Wei Guangming, why would she need to worry about the cold air in her body? Why would she need me to do anything?" Ninkei suddenly felt relaxed and a little angry. He said, "Then why don't you just say it? Why do you have to say so much nonsense to tease me? Teasing people will kill you." The headmaster of the academy was so angry that his beard flew in the air. He said, "How dare you refute me? I have lived dozens of years like you. Even if we don't care about seniority, don't you know how to respect your elders?" Second brother was a serious and polite person. His expression had long become extremely ugly when he saw the headmaster and his disciple verbally fighting each other. However, it was obvious that the headmaster enjoyed this kind of quarrel, so he could only keep his mouth shut and stare at Ninkei coldly with a murderous look. Eldest brother could not stand it anymore. He shook his head helplessly and interrupted the topic. He looked at Ninkei and said, "Youngest brother, I heard that you bought a big house in Chang and—" "Yes," Ninkei replied. Eldest brother did not say anything more. He lowered his head to eat the strawberries and sip the ice. In the parlor of the house by the Yanming Lake, Yi Hongyu held a wooden comb and combed her hair expressionlessly. Her green Taoist robe was still drying. She was now wearing a very ordinary summer dress of a Tang woman. Her beautiful black hair cascaded over her right shoulder. She looked much more gentle and amiable than before. Ninkei looked at her and said, "If you refuse, I can understand." Yi Hongyu stopped combing her hair and looked at him with slight mockery. She said, "I can understand why you want me to refuse. If I enter the second floor of the academy, how can you be proud of yourself?" Ninkei said, "Whatever you think." Yi Hongyu said, "To be a student of the headmaster of the academy is the biggest dream of every cultivator. It is the biggest temptation. I am no exception." Ninkei felt very regretful and sighed in his heart. Yi Hongyu looked at the wooden comb in her hand quietly and said, "But unfortunately, I can only refuse." Ninkei laughed happily and said, "I am also very regretful. Do you know why? Because it is the 250th chapter. I deliberately wrote this chapter as if it was 250. The chapter title is also very silly. I like it very much. The main thing is that I increasingly feel that this world is too noisy and stupid, so I should be more happy in the story. I wish everyone a happy weekend. See you tomorrow." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 446. Ninkei smiled very happily. However, Yi Hongyu felt that his smile was disgusting. She asked coldly, "Can you smile any happier?" Ninkei said, "If you are willing to watch." Yi Hongyu ignored him and said, "I have said before that it is something to be proud of to be a student of the headmaster of the academy. However, there will be a war between the West Hill Divine Kingdom and the Tang Empire in the next few decades. As a member of the Divine Hall, if I become a student of the headmaster of the academy, what will I do when the war starts?" Ninkei did not expect her to give such a reason. He frowned and said, "Long Qing once tried to enter the academy to study. I am not a good-for-nothing like Long Qing. I know how important I am to the Divine Hall, and I know the role I will play in the war." Yi Hongyu said expressionlessly, "I am also not an idiot like Chan Pippi. I did not even think about the trouble that my actions would bring. I just escaped from the temple and escaped to the back of the mountain of the academy." Ninkei said, "Even so, you can just watch." Yi Hongyu said, "I believe in Haotian. My life belongs to Haotian Taoism. How can I watch when the war starts?" Ninkei could not get used to hearing the girl talk about war. He thought to himself, "Are you a war maniac?" He could not help but mock, "If your life belongs to Haotian Taoism, then why did you run away from the Divine Hall? If someone wanted to kill you, you should have stretched out your neck and let them kill you." Yi Hongyu said, "The Divine Hall does not represent Haotian Taoism. The people in the Divine Hall are not qualified to represent the will of Haotian. At least not all of them. Furthermore, I will return one day even if I leave." "That is very honest." Ninkei nodded. He looked into her eyes and said, "But since you may be the strongest opponent of the Tang Empire in the future, why should I let you stay in Chang and now?" Yi Hongyu said, "I have also thought of this. So I have decided that if you become my enemy on the battlefield in the future, I will spare your life." Ninkei shook his head and said, It sounds interesting, but after careful study, I find that it's quite unreliable. War is not something you can just think of. The Tang Empire and the West Hill have been at peace for countless years. Even if there may be disputes in the future, it doesn't necessarily have to be a war. Even if there is a war, I don't think it will happen in the decades that we are alive. So in the end, the rewards you give me are all illusory. Yi Hongyu frowned slightly and looked at him as if she was looking at an idiot. She said, "Haven't you noticed the changes in the cultivation world in recent decades?" Ning Ke completely ignored her gaze and answered honestly, "I've only been in the cultivation circle for less than 2 years. How could I care about any changes?" If you have read the teachings of the West Hill or some historical classics, and have some understanding of the history of the cultivation world, you should know that cultivation is a very difficult thing. In the past 1,000 years, the number of grand cultivators who could enter the knowing destiny state was extremely few. Ning Ke said, "Not many now. But compared to the past, there are a lot more." Yi Hongyu said expressionlessly, "Starting from Mr. Ku of the Academy, the cultivators in the world have continued to climb toward the knowing destiny state and even beyond. Let's not talk about the people of the generation of Divine Lord Lotus. Now Mr. First, Mr. Second, that guy Chin Pippi, many powerhouses of the West Hill Divine Palace, 7 Leaves, my brother, the 2 temples of the Buddhism sect and countless temples of Haotian Taoism. There are already many people who have entered the knowing destiny state. Even though my state has been damaged, it is inevitable that I will enter the knowing destiny state." Yi Hongyu said as if she was saying that cabbages should be fried instead of boiled. Ning Ke shook his head. She looked at him and continued, "Even a guy with poor aptitude and slow comprehension like you can still advance so quickly. I think there will be a day when you will also enter the knowing destiny state." "What are you trying to say?" Ning Ke asked confusedly. The overall strength realm of the cultivation world has been constantly improving over the past few decades. Although the experts of the previous generation are still at the top, a new generation of experts has already emerged on the ground like the stars in the sky. Yi Hongyu said, "Everything in the world is fixed. Haotian's fate will has already arranged their positions. Why are there so many powerhouses? I can't explain it now. I only know that when the stars are crowded in the starry sky, they will definitely collide and attack each other. With so many powerhouses appearing in the world, there will always be a need for war to wipe out the weaker ones." Ning Ke was silent for a long time after listening to these words. He did not completely accept Yi Hongyu's seemingly calm but actually fanatical reasoning. But deep in his heart, he vaguely felt that something was indeed going to happen in the cultivation world. Yi Hongyu looked at his eyes quietly and said, "I don't care about the fate of others. But since Haotian wants me to be one of the stars, then I must be the brightest one." Ning Ke looked up at her and said seriously, "If there is a day when we really fight, then no matter who wins, let's look at the fallen stars in the sky and reminisce." Yi Hongyu's reason for refusing to enter the academy had left a shadow in Ning Ke's heart. That shadow was not a shadow, but just vaguely pointing to some mountain wonders in front of him. It did not make him feel vigilant or uneasy. Instead, it made him, like Yi Hongyu, have an infinite desire for the unknown future. But he had to hide that shadow deep in his heart, because he had more urgent things to deal with now. Today at the back of the mountain of the academy, eldest brother asked about the new house by Yanming Lake. Ning Ke casually answered, and eldest brother did not continue to ask. The conversation seemed casual, but Ning Ke knew that it was definitely not the case. Although eldest brother did not say anything from the wilderness to Chang, and Ning Ke had begun to confirm that he knew about the story between him and Xiao Ho. Even if he did not know about the story from more than a decade ago, he knew about the story in the recent 2 years. Eldest brother knew what he wanted to do. He was even sure that eldest brother had vaguely guessed his intention of buying the house by Yanming Lake. But whether it was eldest brother, second brother, or the teacher, everyone at the back of the mountain of the academy remained silent about his actions. The academy respected the law of the Tang Empire. Eldest brother would not agree with Ning Ke's actions, such as the assassination of Huang Xing and Yu Shuizhu, but there was no evidence to point to him. Ning Ke knew that the decision he made was not in line with the philosophy of the academy. Letting Xiao Ho retire was an agreement that eldest brother had reached with him on behalf of the academy. Cutting off all the past, erasing the old stories of the devil's doctrine in West Hill, and letting the world move towards a stable future was the best choice for the Tang Empire. Unfortunately, that would never be Ning Kei's choice. The next morning, Chan Pippi brought Tang Xiaoting to the shore of Yanming Lake. He looked at the two broken gates and scratched his head in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked. The reason why he went to Yanming Lake again was that after thinking hard for a day and a night, he thought he had figured out those things. He could bravely and fearlessly answer Ning Kei's questions in the Lotus Field boat. He was anxious to show his loyalty in front of Ning Kei, so he did not care too much about the damage to the door. Since the door was broken, there was no need to wait for the owner to open the door. Chan Pippi stretched out his fat legs and kicked randomly, making the already broken door even more broken. He kicked out a space that was just big enough for a person to pass through, and then carefully held Tang Xiaotong's hand and walked in. Tang Xiaotong thought to herself that she had cultivated the divine skill of the Enlightenment doctrine. Even if these wooden stubs pierced 8,000 holes in his fat body, they would not leave a trace on her body. There was no need to be so careful. Although she thought so, the little girl had no intention of objecting. She obediently let Chan Pippi hold her hand and walked into the courtyard. The air after the rain was so fresh, and the two black and beautiful long braids kept swaying in the fresh wind. Walking through the corridor, they met Sang Sang. Chan Pippi did not want Tang Xiaoting to hear what he wanted to say to Ning Kei, so he asked Sang Sang to take Tang Xiaoting to the lake to catch frogs. Sang Sang led Tang Xiaoting to the lake bank. Suddenly, she felt as if she had forgotten something. She subconsciously looked back, only to see that Chan Pippi had already entered the main hall. Crossing the threshold, Chan Pippi saw a girl in handmaiden clothes drinking porridge at the table. He asked curiously, "A new maidservant?" Ning Kei looked up at him in shock. Chan Pippi did not wait for him to reply. He sat down at the table, tapped the porcelain bowl on the table, and said to the girl in a cotton shirt beside him, "Give me a bowl of porridge." He looked at Ning Kei and said, "That's what I said. How could you not hire 8 or 10 maidservants for such a big house by the lake?" The girl in handmaiden clothes actually got up to serve Chan Pippi porridge. Ning Kei held the porridge bowl with a very interesting expression on his face. "Sir, your porridge." The girl gently placed the porridge bowl in front of Chan Pippi. Her words were very humble, but her tone was very cold, or rather indifferent. Chan Pippi was slightly startled when he heard the voice. He raised his head to take a look, and he couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air when he saw a beautiful and moving face. Holding the porridge bowl, Ning Kei was ready to find a corner to hide. If the two geniuses of Hautian Taoism were to fight in his own house, he would not care about what would become of these expensive furniture if he did not want to die. "Your maidservant is really beautiful," Chan Pippi praised. Then he picked up the porridge bowl and began to eat. He said with a lisp, "How much did you pay for it?" Ning Kei opened his mouth and said bitterly after a while, "I can't afford it." Chan Pippi looked at the maidservant's beauty. The more he looked, the more he liked her. The more he looked, the weirder he felt. He frowned and said, "Why does she look so familiar?" The girl drinking porridge at the table was naturally Yi Hongyu. However, her green Taoist robe was stained with wind and frost. It was also soaked by the heavy rain and washed by Sang Sang last night. Thus, she was wearing Song Song's handmaiden clothes. Although it was a little small, it made her look even more timid and attractive. Yi Hongyu looked at Chan Pippi and said calmly, "Sir, you were the one who gave me porridge 10 years ago. How could you forget?" Puff! Chan Pippi spat out all the porridge in his mouth. Even at such a moment, he still forced his fat neck to make sure that the porridge would not spit out on Yi Hongyu. From this, one could imagine the extent of his instinctive fear of someone. Then, he let out a mournful and strange cry, and his whole body flew into the air. He hit the thick and heavy beam, and like a rubber ball, he fell back to the ground. Without the slightest pause, he rushed out of the main hall with a whistling sound. The water and electricity were cut off for a day and a night. All the phones in the house were out of battery. I can't even wash my face or brush my teeth. I can't even flush the toilet. What a miserable world. I thought that there would be electricity, but there was no electricity. I waited until the flowers were broken and the toilet was full. At dawn, I finally plucked up the courage and climbed down the tall building in the dark. The hotel opposite was full, so I went to another hotel and finally found this room. So I updated. I will buy breakfast for my parents and pick up the leader to come to the hotel. Then I will keep an eye on the electricity. I will be very busy and sad, but I will still write. I just don't know how much I can write. Now I realize that as long as there is electricity, other difficulties are nothing. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 447. Although the house by the Yanming Lake had not been completely demolished and rebuilt, many places had been renovated. The main hall, the parlor, and the study were all newly built. The thick beam in the hall had been painted, so there should not be too much dust on it. However, it was raining dust at this time. It was hard to imagine how hard Chun Pippi had hit the beam when he jumped into the air like a frightened fat rabbit. The fat figure could not be seen in the spacious main hall, but the wind was still lingering. Ning-Kei, who was sitting at the table, held the bowl of porridge and felt the sticky moisture on his face. He wanted to throw the bowl to the ground. After Chun Pippi flew out of the main hall, he flapped his sleeves and kept making strange sounds. He was like a fat bird sprinting towards its food. His feet did not touch the ground and he rushed towards the lake embankment, leaving a trail of dust behind him. If he could calm down at this time, he would find that his cultivation state seemed to have improved under the pressure of fear, and he could fly at an unprecedented speed. Tang Xiaotang and Sang Sang were playing with willow branches by the lake. The two girls were like real children singing a song, looking childish and cute. Chun Pippi flew to Tang Xiaotang and stopped. He grabbed her hand and said, "Let's go." Tang Xiaotang looked at him with her eyes wide open and asked, "Where to?" Chun Pippi's answer was unusually concise and powerful. "Back to the academy." "Why?" Tang Xiaotang was even more puzzled. Chun Pippi said in a trembling voice, "There is a monster in this house." If she was an ordinary girl who had just fallen in love, she would not think about whether her partner's words were credible or not. Instead, she would instinctively act timid and follow him. But Tang Xiaotang was not an ordinary girl. She had vowed to become the most powerful woman in the world. Instead of being afraid, her eyes suddenly brightened when she heard that there was a monster in the house. She said happily, "If there is a monster, then we should fight it. Why should we run?" Chun Pippi looked at Tang Xiaotang's braids swaying in the wind and was extremely distressed. He wanted to run, but he had to stop. Because if Tang Xiaotang did not run, how could he run? At this moment, Ning-Kei and Yi Hongyu took a shortcut from the side door of the main hall and walked towards the lake. Tang Xiaotang looked at the beautiful girl in the handmaiden uniform beside Ning-Kei and was confused. She rubbed her eyes subconsciously and confirmed that it was Yi Hongyu. She could not help but be surprised, and her already bright eyes became even brighter. Brighter than the sun in the lake. She slowly clenched her fists. Chun Pippi quickly stood in front of her and said, "Calm down, calm down." Ning-Kei walked to the front of the two and became angrier when he saw Chun Pippi's humble appearance. He said sarcastically, "Calm down. I feel that you, senior martial brother, are the least qualified to say that." Chun Pippi had never been willing to suffer losses in front of Ning-Kei, let alone in front of Tang Xiaotang. He was even more unwilling to lose face. The man's vanity and pride successfully alleviated some of his fear. He turned around and stared into Ning-Kei's eyes, but he refused to look at Yi Hongyu, who was beside him. "How am I not calm?" Ning-Kei sighed and said, "It is not that you are not calm. You are afraid. I don't understand what you are afraid of. This is Chong and not West Hill." Chun Pippi adjusted his standing posture unnaturally and stared at Ning Quebec. He still refused to look away, as if he was trying to convince himself that Yi Hongyu did not exist beside him. Unfortunately, his slightly trembling voice revealed his true emotions. "Afraid? I am afraid of what? Who is afraid?" Ning-Kei pointed at the millet porridge on his face and body and said angrily, "Look at this. Am I not afraid that you will spit rice? You don't dare to spit it on her face. Are you going to spit it on my face?" Tang Xiaotang then noticed that Ning-Kei's face and body were covered with millet porridge. It looked disgusting, but she found it funny when she thought about it. Sang Sang hurried forward and took out a handkerchief from her sleeve to wipe Ning-Kei's face. Ning-Kei took the handkerchief and said angrily, I will do it myself. Don't get this guy's saliva on you. Sang-Sang turned to look at Chun Pippi and did not say anything. She just sighed. Chun Pippi was already extremely embarrassed when he saw the porridge that he had spat on Ning Quebec. When he saw Sang-Sang sigh, he wanted to jump into the Yenming Lake beside him. Yi Hongyu looked at him and said, if you jump into the lake, many of the fish in the lake will be crushed by you, and it will be difficult to climb back up after you jump in. It will be even more embarrassing then. Chun Pippi looked at her beautiful face and wanted to cry. He thought that they had not seen each other for so many years. How could she still know what he was thinking? Tang Xiaoting looked at him and asked in confusion, are you really going to jump into the lake? Chun Pippi nodded obediently. Yi Hongyu was a little surprised and said, you are much more honest than when you were young. Chun Pippi was embarrassed and angry. He gathered his courage and retorted, when was I not honest when I was young? Yi Hongyu said calmly, you peeped at me bathing when you were young. Everyone was silent. The lake was also quiet. The willow branches on the embankment swayed gently in the wind. The wind was not still. Tang Xiaoting looked up at Chun Pippi and asked, did I look good? Chun Pippi nodded honestly and said, yes. Tang Xiaoting said, is that why you ran away when you saw her? Chun Pippi nodded again. Tang Xiaoting thought for a while and said, then you fell into her trap. I fought with her and know that she is a female gangster. Maybe she deliberately tricked you to look. Chun Pippi was a little confused. He scratched his head as if he had discovered the truth. Yi Hongyu said calmly, Fatty Chun, do you think so too? Chun Pippi thought about it seriously for a long time, then shook his head honestly and said, although we both know very well that you were indeed thinking of a way to drive me away, peeking at you was indeed my own decision. I didn't think of anything else at the time. I just wanted to humiliate you. Then he hurriedly added, because you often humiliated me in the monastery. Tang Xiaoting turned and walked to the other side of the embankment. Chun Pippi was anxious and said, I was still a child then. She was not old either. Ning Kei's gaze fell on Yi Hongyu's chest. He wondered how big it was a few years ago. Yi Hongyu felt his gaze and was slightly angry. Ning Kei coughed twice and looked at Chun Pippi. He sighed and said, it turns out that the two of you had such a past. Then I can't help you. Although you were young at that time, such an ugly behavior is really hard to accept. Sang-Sang looked up at him and shook her head. She said, when you were young, you peeped at those sisters bathing. You asked me to keep watch outside the female bathhouse. Ning Kei showed an awkward expression and walked to Chun Pippi's side consciously. The electricity is on. I went home from the hotel. When the elevator stopped, I climbed up to buy food for my parents. My whole body is sore today. I'm really tired. Let me write slowly. Also, today is Monday. Please vote for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 448. Tang Xiaoting walked along the embankment to the wooden stack. After being exposed by Sang-Sang, even though Ning Kei and Chun Pippi stood awkwardly together, he could not help but fly into a rage out of humiliation. He asked her to accompany Tang Xiaoting with the reason that he was worried. Only the three of them were left under the willow embankment. Chun Pippi looked at Tang Xiaoting walking away and shouted helplessly, are you angry because of this? Tang Xiaoting did not turn around. Her clear and bright voice echoed on the lake. I'm not angry because of this. I'm angry because you ran away when you saw her. I'm not afraid of her. You are already in the knowing destiny state. How can you be so afraid of her? It's really embarrassing. The little girl grew up fighting with snowfield direwolves and hot sea ferocious fish. From the shoes on her feet to the black braids behind her, every detail was full of optimistic fighting spirit. It was hard for her to understand where Chun Pippi's fear came from. Chun Pippi lowered his head to look at his toes that were exposed from the front of his robe, but he could only see his round belly. He couldn't help but feel sad. After a long silence, he said in a low voice, ever since I was young, my state has always been higher than hers. But when it comes to a real fight, I can never beat her. Ning Kei looked at him sympathetically and asked, you didn't know she was here? Chan Pippi glanced at Yi Hongyu under the willow and said angrily, "If I knew, why would I come here?" Ning Ke asked confusedly, "Didn't senior brother tell you?" Chan Pippi shook his head. Ning Ke sighed and said, "What a group of bad people." Yi Hongyu walked over from under the willow tree. Chan Pippi turned and walked to the willow tree. They passed each other. Yi Hongyu curled her lips and asked, "Don't you want to catch up?" Chan Pippi waved his hand and said without looking back, "Later, later." Ning Ke sighed and said, "It seems that he is really afraid of you. He doesn't even dare to say such shameless words." Yi Hongyu did not want to bother with this shameless guy. What she wanted to say had nothing to do with Chan Pippi. She said with a cold gaze, "The academy actually takes in the remnants of the devil's doctrine." Ning Ke had already thought about how she would react when she saw Tang Xiaotang, a girl from the devil's doctrine. He smiled and asked, "What do you think?" This rhetorical question was a little arrogant. Ning Ke was not qualified to be arrogant in front of the Tao addict. But in the past 6 months, he knew the history of youngest uncle joining the devil and personally experienced the ignorance of his teacher and senior brothers. He roughly understood the attitude of the academy, and the academy definitely had the right to be arrogant. Yi Hongyu said coldly, "Since this matter involves the academy, it doesn't matter whether I have an opinion or not. But have you ever thought about what will happen if this matter gets out?" Ning Ke said, "So what?" Ning Ke said, "So what? Would the West Hill Divine Palace dare to send people into the back of the mountain to search for people? There are countless devout Haotian believers in the world. They don't need evidence. All they need is a word from the temple." Yi Hongyu said, "The headmaster of the academy might not care about the West Hill Divine Palace, but it is hard for him to deal with the discussions and anger of countless devout believers. He can't kill everyone in the world. If the Divine Hall wants the world to believe that the academy takes in the remnants of the devil's doctrine, the war you told me yesterday will come early. That is not what the Divine Hall wants." Ning Ke looked at her beautiful eyes and suddenly understood something. He said, "Since the master and senior brother asked Chan Pippi to bring Tang Xiaoting here, they don't want to hide it from you. They want you to know about it and pretend you don't know anything. Knowing is knowing. It doesn't mean you can pretend you don't know. Since you are loyal to Haotian Taoism, you should know that pretending you don't know is the best choice for both Haotian Taoism and the academy." Yi Hongyu looked down at the bluestone cracks and the green mud in the cracks. She thought for a long time and said, "You are right." Then she raised her head, looked at Ning Ke quietly and said, "Then what about her and Fatty Chan?" Ning Ke looked at the girl from the devil's doctrine in the boat in the middle of the lake and the fatty who was running along the lake, shouting and joking. His heart softened and he said, "Please pretend you don't know about it." Yi Hongyu stood beside him and watched this interesting scene. There was not a trace of a smile in her eyes. Her expression was very serious and seemed to be getting colder and colder. If you know about Fatty Chen's background, you should know that many people will die if Haotian Taoism knows about it. Chan Pippi and Tang Xiaoting returned to the academy in the evening and did not meet Yi Hongyu again. There was no big fight between the new powerhouses by the Yinming Lake. After dinner, Yi Hongyu thanked Sang Sang politely and sincerely expressed her compliments. Then she returned to her room with the dried green Taoist robe. It seems that she didn't have a good time in the West Hill Divine Palace. Ning Ke looked at her back disappearing in the corridor and said. Sang Sang put away the bowls and asked casually, "How did you know?" Ning Ke looked at the messy bowls and plates on the table and said, "I can't believe she ate such disgusting dishes so happily and thanked you repeatedly." Sang Sang said uneasily, "I told her that I should be the one to cook. Now she thinks that I made these dishes. She must think that I am a bad cook." Ning Ke said, "You are my handmaiden, so you can only serve me. Why should you serve those outsiders? Besides, you are the successor of the Divine Priest of Light and have a higher status than her in the West Hill Divine Palace. She should be the one to serve you." Sang Sang did not say anything. She made him a pot of tea and went to wash the dishes. Ning Ke sat beside the flower rack by the window, holding a teapot and looking at the sky where the red clouds were turning black. His brows gradually furrowed. He was thinking about something. Why did the people in the back of the mountain of the academy let Yi Hongyu know about Tang Xiaotang? Could it really be an extremely arrogant declaration? Or did they inform the West Hill in advance to show respect? Ning-Ke thought about it, and the tea in his hand was getting cold. He still could not figure it out. In the end, he suddenly understood one thing. The people in the back of the mountain, whether it was the teacher, eldest brother or second brother, were basically otherworldly people. They did not have the potential to become great conspirators. The reason why Chan Pippi brought Tang Xiaotang to the lake was probably because they wanted to tell Chan Pippi's family through Tang Xiaotang. For the next few days, the Yanming Lake was quiet. It rained twice and the heat was cut by a bit. Yi Hongyu locked herself in the guest room all day. She was not seen except when she was eating. No one knew what she was doing in the dark room. When she sat at the table and picked up the rice bowl, she became more and more silent. Ning-Ke noticed that her eyes became more and more haggard and her face became paler and paler. He could not help but be vigilant. Zheng Jing and his wife, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library, came to visit. After visiting the house by the lake, they were very satisfied with Ning-Ke's generosity. They were even happier when they found that there was not even a maidservant in the house. They thought that their daughter would live a happy life since she was so favored. Before leaving, Mrs. Zheng hugged Sang Sang and praised Ning Quebec. She told her to come back to the Grand Secretary's mansion more often. The next day, she sent over a dozen stewards and maidservants. Looking at the ordinary and dull maidservants in the courtyard, Ning-Ke could guess what the Grand Secretary's wife was thinking. He could not help but feel a little amused. He thought that if Yi Hongyu did not attend the banquet and Mrs. Zheng saw such a beautiful girl living here, the situation would not be like this. The house by the lake was very large. Even if there were more than a dozen stewards and maidservants, it was not crowded at all. Could not even feel that there were so many people. Sang Sang was not used to being served, so most of the stewards and maidservants stayed in the remote areas of the house. The flower hall and the study were still quiet. The days passed slowly. The summer was getting hotter, the lake wind was getting hotter, and the cicadas were getting noisier. In the house by the Yanming Lake, there were still 3 people eating and 2 people living. Yi Hongyu was still like a ghost, staying in the quiet guest room all day. One day when Ning-Ke came back from the academy, he took a cold shower and asked Sang Sang, who was wiping his body. He found out that Yi Hongyu did not even have dinner that day, and his expression gradually changed. Ning-Ke had always admired and even feared this girl, the Tao addict. In his opinion, when the whole world was destroyed, probably only people like him and the Tao addict could survive. Moreover, he did not think that there was any friendship between him and the Tao addict, so he did not care about her life at all. But he couldn't just watch her shut herself off like this and become an idiot, because that would be a pity. The cicadas were chirping, one louder than the other. The guest room by the Yanming Lake was next to the pier, and one could faintly hear the sound of the lake water beating on the shore not far away. Ning-Ke walked along the stone path into the quiet yard and gently knocked on the door. There were some sounds in the room, as if someone was tidying up. When the door opened, he saw a face that was still beautiful but exceptionally pale. The sky was full of stars shining into the courtyard, and the girl looked more and more haggard. Ning-Ke was shocked and asked, "Are you sick?" "You are sick." Yi Hongyu looked at him expressionlessly and said, "Why are you looking for me?" "I am busy." Ning-Ke ignored her and walked directly into the room. He looked around and did not find any trace of her cultivating any secret skills of the devil's doctrine, such as the practice of Tao Tai. Then he noticed that the bed was still as clean as new, as if no one had slept in it these days. He could not help but be surprised. "You haven't slept these days? Meditation is enough to replenish energy, and sleep will waste more time. Meditation is meditation and sleep is sleep. There is no one in this world who knows this better than me. What do you want to do? What are you in a hurry to do?" Yi Hongyu's voice was a little weak, and she said, "I have said that I need some time to leave the West Hill and come to Chang'an City. Time is very important to me now." Ning-Ke turned to look into her eyes and said seriously, "Although I don't care about your life, and I know that there must be some bigwigs in the West Hill Divine Palace who want you to die, you are after all the Tao addict. If I let you die in my house, there will definitely be big trouble. I don't want to cause trouble. And please continue to cast your precious recommendation votes. Thank you." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian. Calm to cast your recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 449. It was a hot summer night. The starlight was like snow, but it was impossible for it to be cool. Yi Hongyu's face was as pale as snow, and her voice was as cold as ice. However, it made people feel as if she was not in the guest house by the lake, but in a snowy winter. I won't die, so you won't be in trouble. I just need time to cultivate. Ningke thought it was true, but he did not know what amazing cultivation secret she had taken from the divine hall. He said softly, cultivating alone is cultivation, and so is cultivating with each other. If you encounter any bottleneck, you may want to discuss it with me. Maybe it will help you. Yi Hongyu said coldly, will you be so kind? Ningke said calmly, cultivating with us can be a win-win situation. Yi Hongyu said calmly, you said that even Chan Pippi did not dare to humiliate me with such obscene words. I did not expect you to be such a boring person. Ningke was startled and said, how was my previous words obscene? Yi Hongyu looked into his eyes quietly and did not find a trace of shame or embarrassment. She thought that the cultivating with them was a secret in the Divine Hall's teachings. Did this guy really not know? However, she had seen too many shameless and cold-blooded acts of Ningke in the Tianqi Mountains in the wilderness. She would not believe it. She said, you are a student of the headmaster of the academy. Why do you want to steal from me? I said I don't want to steal anything from you. I just want to study with you. Ningke paused and said with a smile, all right, I do want to learn something from you. Although the academy has everything, there are no classics about divine skills. You know divine skills. He stared into her eyes and said, I saw your golden light by the Daming Lake. Yi Hongyu said, divine skills are a secret of Haotian Taoism. Ningke said, Sang Sang is the successor of the divine priest of light. She is qualified to learn divine skills. However, the great divine priest of light died too early, so she did not understand many things. Yi Hongyu frowned slightly. Ningke said, what are you worried about? Are you afraid that your disciple will starve to death? Are you afraid that Sang Sang will become the most powerful young man in West Hill? Yi Hongyu said, are you trying to provoke me? Ningke said yes. Yi Hongyu said, since I know it is a provocation, why would I agree? Ningke smiled and said, because you are the most powerful Tao addict. Are you worried that Sang Sang will surpass you? Yi Hongyu said expressionlessly, I never worry about something that will never happen. Ningke asked, then why didn't you agree? Yi Hongyu thought for a long time and asked, what will you give me in exchange? Ningke answered seriously, rent. Yi Hongyu looked at him quietly and said, I still underestimated you. Ningke asked, how shameless. Yi Hongyu nodded. Ningke turned around and walked out of the room. Yi Hongyu looked at his back and suddenly said, you can't listen. She can't tell you. Ningke stopped, looked back at her and said seriously, I swear by the headmaster's character. Ningke felt it was a pity that he could not find out Yi Hongyu's secret and gain some benefits from it. But he believed that as long as the Tao addict continued to live in Chang, and he would find a chance. Lying on the big bed, he held Song Song's snow-white and ice-cold feet just like he had done in the past 10 summers, enjoying the cool summer that only he could enjoy. I don't understand why she agreed, but this is a good opportunity. Among all the people I have met in the West Hill Divine Palace, only this woman can make me admire her. It doesn't matter how much you cultivate the divine skill. I believe that you can get rid of the cold disease in your body faster. Sang Sang felt her feet itch, so she rubbed them and gently hummed. Ningke looked at the silver starlight outside the window and listened to the sound of cicadas. He suddenly felt the feet in his arms warm up, but his mind was calm and peaceful. He thought that he had traveled with the calligraphy addict and now lived with the Tao addict. Long Qing might be dead, and the flower addict might come for revenge. Maybe he could turn the enemy into a friend, and then he would have a relationship with the 3 addicts in the world. It would be a good story. While he was feeling proud, the silver starlight outside the window suddenly turned into the heavy snow in front of the red wall in Chang, and in winter. He thought of the woman with black hair like a waterfall and picturesque eyes in the snow, and he could not help feeling lost. Sang Sang had always been able to sense his subtle emotions since she was a child. After a moment of silence, she sensed that Ninkei's mood was a little strange. She asked curiously, "What are you thinking about?" Ninkei pinched her little feet and said, "Nothing." He thought that it was a little helpless for a life that was difficult to even fantasize about. No matter what the reason was, Yi Hongyu agreed to cultivate divine skills with Sang Sang. Although Song Song's talent and potential in divine skills had long been recognized by the Great Divine Priest of Light and the Great Divine Priest of Revelation, she had spent the first 15 years of her life cooking, washing vegetables and cleaning tables. Her theoretical understanding of Haotian Taoism's divine skills was very different from that of the Tao addict. Sang Sang nervously walked into the secluded residence. Then the room, which had been quiet for a long time, gradually became bright, and a solemn atmosphere spread with the wind. Fortunately, it was a midsummer day, so it was not too conspicuous. That night, Ninkei and Sang Sang had a serious discussion in bed for a long time. After confirming that he really did not have the talent to cultivate Haotian Taoism's divine skills, he decided to respect the headmaster's character. From then on, he did not ask Sang Sang or try to peep. When Sang Sang walked into the residence again, he stood in the courtyard where several plum blossoms were planted, waiting quietly. The plum blossoms naturally would not bloom in summer. The old twigs had a special kind of beauty, just like his mood at this time. Although he did not gain anything from this matter, it was also good if Sang Sang could gain something. That night, Yi Hongyu was eating a bowl of white rice. Suddenly, she looked up at Ninkei and said, "Do you know how talented your little handmaiden is in cultivation?" Ninkei shook his head and then nodded. He said, "I know it is very talented, but I don't know exactly how talented." Yi Hongyu said calmly, "Very talented. So talented that if I were you, I would be so ashamed that I would hit a pillar when I thought that my handmaiden's cultivation talent was so much higher than mine." Ninkei laughed happily and said, "When I take a bath, no one sees me naked. I am still chaste. Why would I play the game of hitting a pillar like those women in the yamen?" Yi Hongyu looked at him and suddenly said, "When this matter is over, I will definitely kill you, even if it causes a war between the West Hill and the Tang Empire." Ninkei gasped and said with emotion, "So I am so important now?" Studying the divine skill with Sang Sang did not bring much change to Yi Hongyu's life. She still stayed in the guest room for a long time. She was still focused and even a little crazy in her cultivation. Under the sunlight, she stared at the sword torn from the paper in a daze. Occasionally, she would walk out of the guest room and murmur to the sky in the courtyard. She stroked the bent old plum and seemed to be lost in thought. Her face became paler and her eyes became brighter. She looked more haggard, but she was still focused and determined. Ninkei, who was watching from the side, finally understood why she was called the Tao addict. Only the words "addicted to cultivation" could describe this young Taoist priest. Naturally, Ninkei thought of the people in the back of the mountain of the academy, and the saying "life is like a question." He thought of himself climbing the old library, entering the back of the mountain, understanding Talisman Taoism, and even earlier meditating on calligraphy Taoism. He thought that they were all the same and could not help but feel sad. He suddenly walked to Yi Hongyu, who was beside the plum tree. Although cultivation does need to be crazy, it is not right to blindly cultivate. I have some experience. If you relax a little, you can see the sky beyond the pot. Yi Hongyu turned around and looked at him calmly. She said, "Where do you get your pride and confidence to judge that I have not passed the test you mentioned in the past 10 years of cultivation?" Ninkei said, "But you can at least try again now." Yi Hongyu said sarcastically, "How? Take me to the old Taoist temple to worship? Or take me to enjoy the scenery in Chang, and like how you took Imo Shanshan? Or do you want to cultivate together?" Ninkei was slightly embarrassed. It was not because of the word dual cultivation, but because she mentioned the calligraphy addict. After he calmed down, he looked at her and said seriously, "Let's fight." Yi Hongyu's eyes brightened when she heard this suggestion. For a Tao addict like her, this suggestion was in line with her temperament. She smiled and said, "Do you dare to fight with me?" Ninkei said honestly, "Your state of cultivation has dropped a lot, and you have been mentally exhausted these days. If I want to defeat you, this seems to be a good chance." Yi Hongyu said after a moment of silence. The line between life and death is the line in my mind. Ninkei said, same here. Yi Hongyu said, do you really believe that I am weak? Ninkei looked at her eyes quietly and said, maybe your lower state of see-through is just an illusion. But if I don't sweep a house, how can I sweep the world? I don't even dare to challenge you. Speaking of this, he smiled and closed his mouth. He said in his heart, if I don't even dare to challenge you, who is injured and has dropped a state, how can I challenge that powerful enemy? The talisman paper flew in the quiet courtyard. The great spirit attached to it silently turned into the majestic chi of heaven and earth, stirring up a gust of wind in the courtyard. A green belt danced in the wind, like a refined sword, or a fish swimming freely in a transparent lake. The willow tree behind the white wall of the guest house shook, and the shadow gathered and scattered. The ripples on Yanming Lake were dense, like Chan Pippi's face when facing the wind. The wind stopped. The plum tree in the courtyard had long been broken into thousands of broken branches, crushed into a straight line by the two powerful auras. It was on the green slate in the courtyard, neither west nor east. Ninkei was on this side of the plumb line, and Yi Hongyu was on the other side. There is one more chapter. Please vote for it. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 450. A plum blossom line divided the summer courtyard and the autumn scenery equally. Yi Hongyu stood quietly. Her face grew paler, but her eyes were sparkling. Her black Taoist bun was shaken loose and fell on her shoulders. Ninkei raised his arm and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The two did not fight to the death or even win. But Ninkei's face was full of smiles. Even the long blood stain on the corner of his mouth seemed to be laughing, because he was very satisfied with the result of the battle. He did not use the Haotian divine light imitated by the Great Spirit, nor did he draw his knife. He only used the talisman technique to make Yi Hongyu use her natal Taoist fish. This was enough to make him proud. More importantly, from the moment he saw the Tao addict on the snow cliff in the wilderness, this cultivation genius of Haotian Taoism had been the deepest shadow in his heart and the goal he wanted to pursue the most. He had always thought that he was still far away from the Tao addict, but today he was able to tie with her. From the young soldier in the city of Wei who could only meditate and daydream without cultivation to the Academy's entry into the human realm, who could compete with the legendary Tao addict, Ninkei's journey seemed to be smooth sailing. But only he knew how much sweat and blood he had to put in to achieve this. At this moment he did not need to think about the fact that the Tao addict was injured and her state dropped. He felt that he should be proud. However, Yi Hongyu did not want him to be proud. She looked at the ground and said expressionlessly, "You have indeed made rapid progress, even faster than the intelligence of the judicial department. It is also beyond my imagination. But this is nothing to be proud of, because you can't even force me to use my full strength." Ninkei was not affected by her words at all. He waved his fists excitedly, completely ignoring the blood and sweetness in his chest. He said in a hoarse voice, "You are not suitable to learn from Chan Pippi. What's the point of bickering?" Yi Hongyu slowly raised her head and looked at him. Her beautiful black hair slid down from her right shoulder and naturally hung in a perfectly straight bun, like a smooth waterfall. It looked soft, but it actually contained a lot of power. Her expression was calm, her eyebrows were straight and firm, and her eyes were piercingly cold. Ninkei's expression suddenly froze, and he slowly activated his psyche power. The crystal-clear dew of the Great Spirit in his body began to rotate, transferring power to every part of his body. Yi Hongyu looked at him quietly and said, "Do you want to take another blow from me?" Ninkei took a deep breath and said, "Please." Yi Hongyu untied the collar of her green Taoist robe, revealing her fair skin. Ninkei was slightly startled. When he first saw Yi Hongyu in the Tianqi Mountains, she was a beautiful and seductive girl in a red skirt. At that time she had never been stingy with her beauty. However, he believed that she would never use her beauty as a weapon. Then why was she unbuttoning the collar of her Taoist robe? What Yi Hongyu did next shocked Ninkei and made him speechless. She stretched her hand downwards from the neckline. As her hand entered, The thin green Taoist robe became even tighter, revealing the curves of the young girl's chest. It was so beautiful that it made one's heart beat faster. She took out a small piece of paper from her undergarments. The small piece of paper was very small, about the thickness of 2 fingers. Ink lines could be seen on the edges, but the ink lines were blurred by the rain or the young girl's sweat. Ning-Kei looked at the thin piece of paper between her fingers, as if he could smell the slight warmth from it. "This is a sword?" Yi Hongyu said calmly. "This is the strongest sword I have ever cultivated in my life." Ning-Kei's expression gradually turned serious, and he said, "I want to see." Yi Hongyu held the small piece of paper between her fingers and pushed it forward. She was standing at the other end of the plumb line, several feet away from Ning Quebec. However, it was as if the piece of paper between her fingers was really in front of Ning-Kei's eyes when she stretched out her hand. Ning-Kei understood that Yi Hongyu's action of pushing the piece of paper forward was an extremely cold action of drawing a sword. Then he clearly saw the ink lines on the edges of the paper. Then he saw an extremely sharp and extremely powerful sword. The sword did not have any real external shape. There was only an endless, terrifying sword style that was like a great river coming from the sky. The sword style proudly laid across the courtyard and stopped on the plumb line, quietly in Yi Hongyu's hand. It spewed towards Ning-Kei's eyebrows, using an invisible intent to form a visible wound. Ning-Kei felt a great sense of danger, and the great spirit in his body suddenly circulated violently. However, the sword was too fast and the sword style was too sudden. The sword style completely ignored time and enveloped his entire body in an instant. Before he could react, the sword had already struck him. The sword momentum formed by the sword essence of the paper sword did not have any actual sharp blade. Like a turbid wave, it directly smashed over. The enormous power contained in the sword momentum directly knocked him off the ground. Like a fallen bird, he flew backwards and finally crashed heavily into the wall of the courtyard, making a muffled sound. The newly painted wall dust fell off, revealing the black bricks inside. Ning-Kei sat under the wall and spat out a mouthful of blood. The dust from the wall was all over his face, and when he was washed by the blood, there were many ravines on his clothes. It was a tragic sight. He raised his hand with difficulty to wipe the blood off his chest, and looked at the thin piece of paper that Yi Hongyu was holding in between her slender fingers. His eyes were filled with horror. "What is this sword?" Yi Hongyu did not tell him. Ning-Kei naturally did not know that the piece of paper between her fingers was the world's strongest powerhouse, the Sage of Sword Liu Bai. He had condensed half of his life sword Taoism into a clumsy sword style. It was universally acknowledged that the Tao addict's talent in cultivation was peerless. However, she had pondered for so many days and still could not completely understand this thin paper sword. However, even if she could only understand a little of it, she could still blind Chanbachi, who was at the upper state of see-through, with a casual wave of her slender fingers. How could Ning-Kei resist it? Yi Hongyu walked past the line formed by the plumb line and nodded slightly to Ning-Kei, who was in the corner. She said, "Thank you." After saying this, she turned around and returned to the guest room. Ning-Kei supported himself against the wall and stood up with difficulty. He looked at the closed door thoughtfully. At this time he could already confirm that Yi Hongyu's secret was that small paper sword. The reason why she said thank you to him was probably because she had finally made some progress in her cultivation after today's battle. However, he did not understand. Although Yi Hongyu's state had indeed fallen to the lower see-through state, she hid the small paper sword in her undergarments. Her real power was probably at the threshold of the knowing destiny state or even further. If so, why would someone in the West Hill Divine Palace, who believed in power, want to deal with her? Did she hide her power? Why did she hide her strength and was so anxious to obtain more power? Why was she hiding her strength and so anxious? Who in the Divine Hall was worthy of her spending so much effort to deal with? Thinking of a faint possibility, Ning-Kei had long forgotten the pain in his body. Looking at the closed door, he was shocked beyond words. He thought that the Tao addict was indeed the Tao addict. Not only was her cultivation state higher than his, but even what she wanted to do was more vigorous than what he wanted to do. After the parting battle, Ning-Kei and Yi Hongyu studied or fought together many times. These two young people who were best at fighting in the cultivation world fought in the courtyard, in the lotus field, under the shade of willow trees, and among the cliffs. The more they fought, the more they felt like they were fighting with another version of themselves in the world. They were intoxicated and crazy with the battle. However, Yi Hongyu did not use the thin paper sword in the following battles, and Ningke did not win any of her battles. Fortunately, the so-called life and death battle was just an excuse to put pressure on himself before the battle. Otherwise, he would have died even if he had 9 lives. Without the paper sword, Ningke still could not win against the Tao addict. He had lost so many battles. If it were an ordinary person, he would probably be frustrated to the point of numbness and give up. However, he did not feel this way at all. He cherished the opportunity to fight with the Tao addict and kept learning from it. Ningke wanted to see the small paper sword again. But he admired Yi Hongyu's changes in Taoism law in the battle. It was a powerful thing to know everything. What was even more powerful was Yi Hongyu's speed and decisiveness in choosing which Taoism law to fight with. It was as if she had already guessed what he was going to do before he attacked. Other than the primordial 13 arrows, Ningke had used all his means in the battle these days. He had even used the Haotian divine light that was imitated by the Great Spirit, but he still lost badly. At this moment, he recalled the battle by the Daming Lake last year. Yi Hongyu had used the ice fish formed by the lake water to dissolve the primordial 13 arrows. Ningke was sure that it had nothing to do with calculation, but her instinctive reaction. He could not help but feel that it was even more terrifying. This kind of instinctive reaction could completely pull apart an enemy of the same state in battle. One morning Ningke, who had lost another battle, looked at Yi Hongyu under the shade of willow trees. He finally could not control the confusion in his heart and asked, "How did you do it?" In these days of battle, Yi Hongyu had also learned a lot. Her body had become much healthier, and she had made progress in understanding the paper sword. Moreover, she had once again confirmed the fact that Ningke was not the opponent with the highest state she had ever met, but he was the most difficult opponent she had ever met. This man was not like ordinary cultivators who could only use flying swords and talismans to attack foolishly. He could really fight. Because she had confirmed this fact, she also confirmed that among the disciples of the second floor of the academy, Ningke should be ranked in the top 3 on the kill list, only after Mr. First and Mr. Second. But that was all in the future. She did not mind Ningke becoming stronger now because she had enough confidence. Therefore, she decided to teach Ningke some things. Do you know what knowing destiny state is? The shade of the willow covered the girl's slightly rosy and beautiful face. It was cool, and even her emotionless question became cool and pleasant. "I'm sleepy. I don't have anything today. I'm thinking if I should open a ticket and ask for votes." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 451. 2 years ago, on the journey from the city of Wei to Chang'an, Liu Qingchen once told Ningke what the knowing destiny state was. Later, when he entered the academy and left the old library at night, he also asked Chan Pippi to show him the knowing destiny state. At that time, the sky was covered with stars, and the fish in the wetland lake were suspended in it, like still objects in amber, or kites in the transparent sky, which was very magical. Unlike the see-through state, where you only understand the rules of the qi of heaven and earth on the surface, you have mastered the rules of the qi of heaven and earth in essence. You can understand the origin of the world and clearly capture the connection between Haotian and all things in nature. Only then can you know the destiny and truly achieve Tao. Yi Hongyu said, "Entering the knowing destiny state means you have entered the ranks of grand cultivators. If you can even know the destiny, you can naturally perceive the slightest changes in the qi of heaven and earth. Then in a battle, no matter what the enemy does, they can't surpass their experience and perception. This is the real horror of the knowing destiny state." Ningke looked at the reflection of the willow branches in the lake and thought for a long time. Then he asked, "But you are now only in the lower see-through state. Why do I still have such a hard time fighting with you?" "I have crossed that threshold and entered the knowing destiny state." Yi Hongyu said, "Once I have seen it, I can't forget it. So even if my state keeps falling, my consciousness is still in the knowing destiny state. Naturally, you are no match for me." The willow branches on the lake bank swayed with the wind. The drooping branches and leaves touched the surface of the lake from time to time, causing ripples. They were like dragonflies skimming the water, breaking the reflection on the water into pieces. Ninkei looked at the swaying lake and the willow shadows and asked in a low voice, "So if I want to defeat a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state, I have to cross that threshold first?" The 5 states of cultivation are very strict. It is basically very difficult to challenge someone in a higher state without any special circumstances. But from the perceiving state to the no-doubt state, and from the no-doubt state to the see-through state with the right time, place, and people with some help, there are occasionally successful challenges. Yi Hongyu said, for example, last year on the snow cliff in the wilderness, you shot Long Qing with 1 arrow. Also, before I entered the see-through state, I defeated an instructor of the Revelation Institute who was in the middle state of the see-through state. But the knowing destiny state is the real peak of cultivation. It is beyond the mortal world, and there is an insurmountable gap between it and the other 4 states. If a cultivator in the see-through state wants to challenge a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state, it is like a mantis stretching out its forelimbs to stop a carriage on the road. He is destined to be crushed to death. Ninkei looked at the water reptiles that were chasing Luing on the surface of the lake and asked calmly, "I just want to know if there are any successful cases. Just one is enough. If you want to see the battle between me and Chun Pippi as a real example, then I can tell you that I can defeat him at any time. But you should know that this is a special case. Other than that, in the West Hill Classics, there has never been a case of a see-through state cultivator successfully challenging a knowing destiny state cultivator." Ninkei's face looked a little disappointed. Yi Hongyu looked at his expression and said hesitantly, "But other than the records in the classics, I heard from the elders in the Divine Hall that Mr. Ku once left the academy halfway before his cultivation was completed. It was on that journey that he defeated a powerhouse in the knowing destiny state when he was still in the see-through state." Ninkei's eyes suddenly lit up as he listened to this past that had no real evidence. He was very clear that there was an infinite gap between him and youngest uncle, no matter in cultivation talent or any other aspect. But at least this had happened before, so no matter how small the concept of succeeding in a cross-state challenge was, it would not be as cold and despairing as he had thought before. He turned to look at the girl under the shade of the willow and asked, "The powerhouses in the peak state of martial arts and the powerhouses in the Devil's Doctrine, how should their states be calculated?" The concept of the peak state of martial arts originated from the Devil's Doctrine. Yi Hongyu said, "This state is similar to the knowing destiny state, but they take 2 completely different paths. The knowing destiny state refers to the understanding and mastery of heaven and earth. The powerhouses in the Devil's Doctrine pursue extreme power and create another world within themselves. They do not communicate with the outside world at all and try to replace Haotian. Although this cultivation concept is extremely evil and arrogant, I have to admit that it is extremely powerful." Ninkei looked at the girl's gradually stern eyes and suddenly asked, "The Taoist sect and the Devil's Doctrine are incompatible. All the disciples of Haotian Taoism that I have seen, whether it is you or Chun Pippi, hate the Devil's Doctrine to the extreme. Now that Chun Pippi has started dating a girl from the Devil's Doctrine, I still don't understand. The Divine Hall should know very well that Xiaohou is a remnant of the Devil's Doctrine. Why do they allow him to live so well?" Yi Hongyu looked at him quietly as if she understood why he would ask such a question. She also understood the undisguised coldness and sarcasm in his tone. The West Hill Divine Palace protects the world on behalf of Haotian. They need power, especially when the Tang Empire still exists. The Divine Hall needs power even more, and Xiaohou is one of the most powerful powers in the world in the past decades. Yi Hongyu said calmly, "Xiaohou is a broadsword that can split mountains and seas. Both the Divine Hall and the Tang Empire want to hold this broadsword in their hands. The two have fought for decades to form this complicated situation. Xiaohou is a very useful broadsword for the Divine Hall. He is a broadsword of the highest level in the Tang Empire and even the military. How could they bear to let him go?" The blazing sun shone on Chang'an City. The wind blew from the Yanming Mountain on the south bank, bringing with it a sense of dryness. Even with the ripples of the lake and the shade of the willow trees cooling down, it still made people feel a little stuffy. It was quiet on the lake bank and willow trees. After an unknown period of time, Ning-K looked at Yi Hongyu and said seriously, I need power now. Yi Hongyu was silent. Ning-K looked into her eyes and continued, what you need now is time, and in fact power. Yi Hongyu said, I don't deny that. Ning-K said, can you help me? Yi Hongyu looked at him and said, what are you going to give me in exchange? It can't be rent this time. Ning-K asked, what do you want? Yi Hongyu said, Howrun sword. One was the great Tao addict of the West Hill Divine Palace, and the other was the new student of the headmaster of the academy in Chang'an City. Yi Hongyu and Ning-K were destined to never be true friends, no matter their standpoint or their past. Even if they cultivated together and learned from each other, they would only think about what would happen if they became enemies. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for the two of them to think about what real benefits they could gain from each other. However, when Ning-K asked, Yi Hongyu's answer was so quick and concise, as if she had been thinking about it for countless days and nights. Interestingly, Ning-K seemed to have been mentally prepared for this scene for a long time. When he heard Yi Hongyu's request, he was not surprised at all. He asked, what are you offering? Yi Hongyu said, you saw my bargaining chip the other day. Ning-K frowned and thought for a long time. He said, do you have complete autonomy over your bargaining chip? Yi Hongyu said, since he gave it to me, it is mine. Ning-K looked at her and said, unfortunately, my bargaining chip belongs to the academy. I don't have complete autonomy. I need to go back to the academy and ask the headmaster for his opinion. Yi Hongyu said, go ahead. I don't think I need to remind you that this matter needs to be kept secret. Ning-K nodded and left Yanming Lake. The grass hut at the back of the mountain of the academy was facing the wind. Fortunately, the mountain was lush with plants and was covered by the Cloud Gate tactical array. The primordial chi was abundant, and the wind in the hut was not as hot as the wind by Yanming Lake. The headmaster sat on the futon with a book in his left hand and a pen in his right hand. He was copying something. Ning-K sat cross-legged on the futon by the desk. Ever since he arrived at the back of the mountain of the academy and entered the grass hut, he had been sitting on the futon for a long time under the headmaster's orders. The history book on the desk had been moved forward for 2 years. He had tried to speak during this period, but the headmaster did not respond at all. He was still focused on copying the book, as if his young disciple's words were just the wind blowing in from outside the hut. The headmaster casually threw the yellowish and old book in his left hand onto the desk. He put the pen on the inkstone, rubbed his wrist and stretched. Ning-K stood up as fast as he could. He took out a towel from the basin and wrung it dry. He handed it to the headmaster and poured away the remaining tea on the desk, replacing it with a hot one. You can't rush things. The headmaster threw away the towel and picked up the slightly hot teacup. He gently blew the foam on the surface and said, just like tea, how can you drink it if it's too hot? Ning-K was only thinking about how to get the thin paper sword on Yi Hongyu's chest, and did not listen to his teacher's words. He rubbed his hands nervously and said, but this hot tea is going to get cold if we don't drink it now. The headmaster turned to look at him and said with a smile, if that's the case, you can drink that cup of tea yourself. Why bother asking me? In the whole back of the mountain, you have always been the one with the most ideas. Ning-K had no choice but to listen to the instruction and warning hidden in his words. His body suddenly stiffened and he said with a bitter face, I don't have the money for the tea. The money belongs to the academy and my teacher. The most important thing is that even though I have ideas, I really don't dare to have any ideas on such a big matter. What is an idea? The headmaster said, an idea is what you think when you are faced with a choice. Which direction do you choose at the fork? To change or not to change, which choice do you want to make? Ning-K was very honest, or rather dishonest, and asked, how should I choose? The headmaster almost choked on his words. He angrily scolded, how do you want to bother me with such a simple matter? You idiot! Of course you have to choose the one that is beneficial to you. What do you want the most if you can do it all over again? Help your father manage the factory and successfully build yourself into a rich second generation. Flirting with a girl that you once passed by, holding hands and kissing on the forehead? Perhaps you should let those regrets of the past no longer become regrets. P.S. There are more today. I will continue to write. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 452. The mountain wind blew into the hut, causing the gauze curtains to sway. Mist rose from the teacup in the headmaster's hand and dissipated instantly. The hot tea in the cup would probably cool down faster. Ninkei was not Chun-Pippy, and his face was not wrinkled by the wind. However, after being reprimanded by the headmaster, he could not help but look a little worried. He said, "I just want you to see if there are more advantages or disadvantages." The headmaster took a sip of tea and put down the teacup. He shook his head and said, "I'm already so old. I don't have the energy to think about these small things. Do you think it's worth it?" Ninkei said seriously, "Ever since she made this request, I have been thinking about it. The Haoran sword is indeed the most famous sword Taoism skill in our academy. However, without youngest uncle's great spirit, it is actually not a cultivation method that can't be taught to outsiders." The headmaster did not comment and said, "Continue." Ninkei recalled the scene of him fighting with Yi Hongyu in the courtyard. He thought of the paper sword she was holding between her fingers and said hesitantly, "Although I don't understand the paper sword she was holding, it is indeed interesting. I even suspect that it might be the South Gene." The headmaster frowned and looked at him. He said unhappily, "Make it simple." Ninkei said honestly, "I think it's worth it." The headmaster said casually, "In that case, what are you hesitating for? Let's change." The academy's unique skill, the Haoran sword, was given away just like that. The headmaster's expression was so indifferent, as if he had given away a withered cabbage. Ninkei could not adapt to the atmosphere. After a moment of hesitation, he looked at the headmaster and asked, "Teacher, don't you have anything to ask me?" The headmaster took the scroll and was ready to continue what he was doing. He said casually, "What is there to ask?" Ninkei asked with a hopeful expression, "What if I die?" The headmaster didn't even look up. He looked at the scroll in his hand and waited for the ink to melt. He said, "Everyone will die. If you die, I won't need you to remind me." Ninkei's heart, which had been soaked in corpse water and was invulnerable to all kinds of poison, finally split into two pieces after hearing his teacher's irresponsible and even cold words. One piece was left for Sang Sang, and the other turned into a fire that burned the headmaster's beard in his imagination. Ninkei first went to second brother's courtyard and made his request in the sound of the waterfall. Then he went to the cliff cave where tens of thousands of books were hidden. Finally, he passed through the cloud gate array and went to the second floor of the old library. He took out several books related to Haoran sword from the bookshelf and walked to the east window to ask third sister to register. The whole process of retrieving the book was very smooth, so smooth that it was a little strange. The headmaster of the academy had given him a very irresponsible verbal order. Second brother, the scholar, and third sister had irresponsibly given him what he wanted without asking for anything. So when he sat in the carriage with the thick books, he was still in a daze. He thought that according to today's experience, he could steal those precious cultivation books from the academy anytime and anywhere. In this case, he would not have to worry about food and clothing for the rest of his life. Returning to the house by the Yanming Lake, Ninkei went directly to the backyard and threw all the thick books in his arms on the desk. He said, "Here are the things you want." Yi Hongyu picked up a book from the table and frowned slightly. Even she did not expect that the academy would allow Ninkei to take out such a precious cultivation book so casually. She even doubted the authenticity of these books. However, when she opened the cover page, she knew that they were real. Ninkei found that the book in her hand was a preliminary exploration of Haoran sword. It was the same book that he had read in the old library when he vomited blood. He could not help but feel a little emotional. After a moment, he got rid of this emotion and looked at Yi Hongyu, who was immersed in the book. He reminded her, "What about mine?" Yi Hongyu raised her hand and slowly untied the cloth button on the collar of her Taoist robe. Ninkei stared at the movement of her fingers. At this moment, he did not know whether he was looking forward to the paper sword that seemed to contain countless mysteries, or the white and graceful scenery under the Taoist robe. Yi Hongyu took out the thin paper sword that was hidden deep in her undergarments but did not hand it over. Instead, she stared at Ninkei's eyes and said, "I have 2 requests." Ninkei said, "Go ahead." Yi Hongyu said, "You can only read this paper sword for 1 night." Ninkei shook his head and said, "Impossible. Unless you also only read these books about cultivating Howren sword for 1 night?" Yi Hongyu smiled slightly and was about to say something. Ninkei suddenly thought that the young Taoist girl in front of him was a genius in the cultivation world. She might really have a terrifying photographic memory like Sang Sang. He quickly stopped her and said, "It is not appropriate to limit the time so strictly. I agree that you can read it for a few more nights. Then I will also read it for a few more nights." Yi Hongyu looked at him quietly and then laughed. She shook her head and said, "You reacted quickly." Ninkei said, "I am not a person who is willing to be taken advantage of." Yi Hongyu said, 3 nights. Ninkei thought for a moment and said, "Deal." Then he asked curiously, "What is the second condition?" Yi Hongyu looked at the paper sword between her fingers and said, "You are not allowed to smell it." This paper sword had been hidden in her chest for a long time. No one knew how much sweat and body odor it had stained it. If it was an ordinary girl, she would probably be extremely embarrassed. Although Yi Hongyu was not that embarrassed, she did not want Ninkei to do those disgusting things. Ninkei looked at her and said seriously, "Do I look like such a perverted person?" Yi Hongyu said with a smile, "Younger sister Sang Sang grew up with you. You made her your lover before she became an adult. This is a very perverted behavior." Cicadas and frogs croaked occasionally in the courtyard in the summer night. Ninkei looked at the paper sword between his fingers quietly with the help of the light from the oil lamp. Sang Sang had accompanied him to stare at the small paper sword in a daze. At this time she finally could not resist the drowsiness and went to sleep. Ninkei felt the touch of the paper between his fingers and subconsciously rubbed it gently. This action looked a little obscene, but in fact, he did not have any obscene thoughts. He also did not think that this thin piece of paper had gently rubbed between the soft flesh of the Tao addict's chest. He just wanted to use this action to relieve the tension in his heart. This paper sword was very thin, and the paper was ordinary. It was only the size of 2 human fingers. The edge of the paper sword was covered with uneven thickness ink lines, and outside the ink lines were some rough edges of the paper. At the beginning, this should be a small sword drawn on the paper, and then it was torn by someone. From the ink lines on the edge of the paper sword, one could draw a conclusion that the person who drew the sword was not good at using a brush, and his state of painting was very low. However, that person's state of cultivation was very high, so high that the ink line seemed to be the edge of a real sword. The yellowish light made the thin paper between his fingers darker and more yellow. Ninkei stared at the paper sword, and his expression became more and more serious and nervous. At night, the lakeside courtyard was not as stuffy as it was during the day. However, sweat began to ooze from his face, and gradually became the size of a soybean, slowly dripping down from his cheeks. More and more sweat kept gushing out from his back, gradually wetting his thin shirt and pants, soaking through the cloth, and then flowed along the legs of the chair to the ground. At this moment, his body seemed to be a ball of cotton full of water, which was forced by the strong and majestic invisible sword style on the paper sword, and began to drip continuously. The reason for this was that his psyche power had broken through the sharp and invisible edge of the paper sword, which made the sense of perception extremely painful, and entered the inside of the paper sword, so that he could feel the truth of the sword style. In the battle in the villa a few days ago, when Yi Hongyu took out the small paper sword from her arms, he had felt the horrible sword style attached to the paper like a river coming from the sky. At this time the little paper sword was lying quietly between his fingers, so he could feel this sword intent more delicately and more vividly. After meditating for half a night, he finally understood that this sword intent was not imitating the power of a great river hanging upside down from the clouds of the 9th heaven, but describing the great river itself. This fact proved one of Ninkei's conjectures. He felt that the light paper sword between his fingers had suddenly become incomparably heavy. He felt the surging yellow waves, constantly washing his body and hitting his sense of perception, as if they could break through the embankment at the edge of the sense of perception and spread to the wilderness at any time. In the sword style he felt like falling into the depths of a river, feeling the strong pressure everywhere. In the bedroom of Xia Yi, he was like a real drowning person, with a pale face, short of breath, and sweat pouring out of his body like a waterfall. In the early morning, Ning Ke woke up from the state of meditation. The round chair he was sitting on was full of water. The green brick floor beneath the armchair had also been soaked in a large patch. The paper sword between his fingers had also been soaked with sweat and had become somewhat transparent. However, the sword drawn on the paper was still as clear as ever. It was as if the ink lines had some kind of magical power that allowed it to be unaffected by the world. Sang Sang looked at him with a worried face. Ning Ke looked at her and squeezed out a smile with difficulty, saying, "I'm okay." He was shocked by his own voice, which was so hoarse and dry, as if he had been in the desert without water for more than 10 days. He immediately understood that this was the result of a serious lack of water. He said, "Boil a pot of porridge and bring me the sealwort hidden in the study. I need to nourish myself." "That sealwort has been boiled into the porridge. I saw that you were sweating too much, so I added some salt." Sang Sang took a bowl of mixed porridge from the small table beside her, looked at him and said carefully, "Do you still have strength? Do you need me to feed you?" After replenishing some of his energy, Ning Ke returned to the yard and returned the paper sword to Yi Hongyu. After one night of watching the sword, he had confirmed many things. He knew that with his current state of cultivation, this was the most he could comprehend. It would be meaningless even if he watched it for another 2 nights. Yi Hongyu looked at his pale cheeks and said with emotion, "You clearly know where the limit of your ability is and can resist the temptation of this paper sword. You are not stupid and greedy. I have to admit that although your aptitude is average, your temperament is first class in the world." If it was any other day, Ning Ke would definitely show a proud expression after being praised by the Tao addict. However, he had something on his mind today. The sword in his sense of perception did not say much to her and left. He left Yanming Lake by horse carriage and went to the academy as fast as he could. He passed through the cloud gate array and entered the back of the mountain of the academy. He did not have time to say hello to his senior brothers and sisters at the Mirror Lake. He frowned and talked to himself all the way to the cliff cave on the mountainside. In the pavilion by the quiet lake, Seventh Sister put down the embroidery needle in her hand and looked at Ning Ke's back disappearing into the forest. She frowned and murmured, "Youngest brother. Looks a little weird today, as if he is crazy." Sixth brother, who was repairing the water wheel by the stream and releasing fish for the big white goose wooden fish, straightened up and looked in that direction. He shook his head and said, "Why does youngest brother look like 11th brother today?" Ning Ke did not know what his senior brothers and sisters were talking about. He walked to the bottom of the cliff cave like a silly guy and walked to the scholar's table. The scholar was reading and did not even look up at him. Ning Ke stood beside the scholar and stopped talking to himself. He was silent for a long time. When those lines gradually overlapped and formed in his sense of perception, his eyes brightened. He walked directly to the back of the table and pushed the scholar away from the chair. He took a piece of paper and a brush pen and dipped it in ink. He began to immerse himself in writing. The scholar was the most strange existence in the back of the mountain of the academy. He was usually very good-tempered, but if someone disturbed his reading, his temper would become very bad. Even eldest brother or second brother did not dare to disturb him when he was absorbed in reading. Today he was so violently pushed away by Ning Quebec. He was holding a roll of agricultural books with great interest. He suddenly became angry and rolled up his sleeves to beat Ning Quebec. However, when he saw what Ning Ke wrote on the paper, his fist that had been raised in the air slowly fell down. He curiously stood behind Ning Ke and looked at it more and more attentively. It did not take long for Ning Ke to finish what he wanted to do. He put the brush pen on the inkstone and raised the paper to the air to carefully look at it in the sunlight. He confirmed that although it was impossible for him to completely simulate the majestic sword style of the Great River, this was already the best he could do. He suddenly found that the scholar was behind him and staring at the paper in his hand in a daze. He hurriedly explained, "I know this sword painting is really a little ugly, but it's none of my business." "How is this sword ugly?" The scholar clasped his hands behind his back and slightly bent his body. He looked at the crooked small sword on the paper and praised, "I haven't seen such a beautiful sword for many years." Ning-Ke was greatly shocked. He thought that this guy who only knew how to read could also understand this sword. He subconsciously asked, "Sir, have you seen something similar before?" The scholar did not turn back. He pointed to the cliff cave behind him and said, "There are many classics of sword tactics and cultivation methods in there. Some authors like to illustrate and annotate, so I have seen some swords." Ning-Ke thought that it was so. He curiously asked, "What do you think of this sword? If the sword you copied is nothing compared to the countless swords in the cave, but your sword has the spirit of the original person who drew it. That's wonderful." The scholar said, "I don't understand painting or swords, but I can understand the spirit of this sword. In my opinion, this sword can be ranked in the top 5 among the Academy's 1,000 years of collection. Continue writing, there will be more later. Thank you for your votes. Please continue to vote for it. It seems to be quite close to the first place in the weekly list. Let's go for it." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 453. Inside the hut, the mountain breeze was gentle and pleasant, just like the headmaster's mood. Eldest brother and second brother sat quietly by the table, one grinding ink and the other making tea. The headmaster waved his hand and said with a smile, "I'm happy today, so I won't write anymore." Second brother opened his mouth slightly and was about to say something. But he was the first gentleman in the world and could not do such a thing in front of his beloved teacher. Finally, he closed his mouth and continued grinding ink with a serious expression. Eldest brother looked at Junmo's expression and could not help shaking his head with a smile. Then he looked at the teacher behind the table and asked softly, "Teacher, why are you happy?" The headmaster laughed and said, "It's a good deal to exchange the Howren sword without great spirit for Lu Bai's day sword. Of course I'm happy." Eldest brother smiled and said, "I see." The headmaster stroked his beard and said, "That sword not only has the shape but also some of Lu Bai's charm. Your youngest brother is a superb calligrapher in the world and is best at copying. He also comprehended the art of separating words and memorizing them with the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong. He is indeed the best person in the academy to do this." The headmaster and eldest brother were happy, but second brother was not. Lu Bai was recognized as the most powerful man in the world and was called the Sword Sage. But in his heart, the powerful man from the South Jin Kingdom was just an enemy that he would defeat in his cultivation and battle life. He was just a stone step that he would step on in the future. The day sword style contained in the paper sword was not qualified to be compared to the Howren sword left behind by his youngest uncle, even if it was a Howren sword without the great spirit. Second brother had always been a straightforward person who disdained to hide his emotions. Whatever he was thinking, he would show it on his face. However, as a person who respected his teacher, he could not refute the headmaster's words. Thus, he remained silent and continued to grind the ink, moving faster and faster. The ink in the square inkstone accumulated more and more and gradually formed a lake. The ink block rotated at a high speed and rolled up a black whirlpool. But strangely, no ink spilled out. The headmaster looked at the ink in the inkstone and sighed. It is said that dripping water can wear through a stone and grinding a pestle into a needle. But I have never heard of grinding ink through an inkstone. Second brother suddenly came to his senses and stopped what he was doing and sincerely apologized to the teacher. The headmaster looked at him and said, "Say what you want to say." Second senior brother frowned slightly and said, "Although Lu Bai's swordsmanship has some merits, it is not worthy of being on an equal footing with youngest uncle's Howren sword. Moreover, youngest brother's methods are not very honorable." The headmaster said, "Since it is good, we should take it generously." The headmaster frowned even more. He thought the headmaster of second brother's words and thought. Suddenly, he realized that he had been so disrespectful to his teacher, and he couldn't help but feel regret. Suddenly, he realized that he had been so disrespectful to the headmaster and felt and said he was master of the day sword, and said, Lu of the uncle, academy teacher of master, Sword of the ocean of the Lu of teacher of sword, teacher of brother of the sword of master, said. It is the same reason why the academy accepted the day sword. We are just preserving the wisdom of the previous generations, and hope that it will sprout again. The headmaster and the eldest brother thought of the countless books in the cave at the back of the mountain. The second brother was shocked and hated himself for what he had done. He knelt on the futon and bowed to the headmaster. He said in a low voice, I know I was wrong. I will go to all the cultivation sects in the world and ask them for their cultivation manuals. The expressions of the headmaster and eldest brother changed slightly, and they subconsciously wanted to find tea to drink. They thought that if they really asked those sects to hand over their cultivation manuals in the name of preserving human civilization, they would definitely think that they were crazy or robbers. Jun Mo, on the other hand, was a proud person who would do whatever he set his mind to, and would not give in even if he was in the right. If those sects refused to hand over their cultivation manuals, he would definitely not care about robbing them. Then the so-called asking would naturally become robbing, and there would probably be a bloody battle in the cultivation world. The headmaster looked at him and reprimanded him in a low voice. If I could throw away my pride and not rob, I would have taken Lu Bai back to the academy and forced him to write it out when he comprehended the day sword. Why would I need your youngest brother to spend so much effort on this? I don't even know what you are thinking about. The eldest brother shook his head and said, Of course it is voluntary. The second brother was confused by the headmaster's scolding. He said, But youngest brother's behavior is almost stealing. It is not much different from robbing. The headmaster of the academy was embarrassed. The eldest brother poured the tea at a speed that was rarely seen. He said respectfully, Teacher, please have some tea. The headmaster of the academy took the tea and took a sip. He looked at his favorite eldest disciple and praised, You are worth teaching. The second brother frowned and thought hard. What could he not be taught? The wild geese that spent the summer at Shuanyang Lake in the Gushan Commandery returned to Chang'an. They circled around the old Buddhist pagoda for a few days. Their shadows covered the sky and they chirped in the mountains in Yanming Lake. Then they flapped their wings and flew south to the warmer Great Swamp. They would not come back until next spring. The door of the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street had not been opened for a long time. The wild cat was lying on the wall and basking in the cooling sunshine. It looked at the dusty patio indifferently and wondered how many days had passed since the guy who had hit it with firewood died, and whether his body had been exposed in the wilderness. At the entrance of the alley, there was a barbecue stand. Boss Wu kept an old dog. Every morning and dusk, he would walk the dog to relieve his loneliness and stress from his wife. As the weather got colder and colder, he would walk the dog once a day instead of twice a day, and the time was now noon. The gambling house in the West City was still thriving. Mr. Chi wore a long silk gown and played an iron ball in his hand. He accepted the compliments of his neighbors with a reserved manner like a rich man and wondered when second brother Chow would come back. The Taoist who performed talisman arts in the Taoist temple on Vermilion Bird Street was sick. But the Taoist temple was renovated, so more believers came to the temple to pray devoutly than before. Regardless of the passage of time or the change of seasons, the Tangs in Chang'an lived a peaceful and happy life as before. The hearty laughter in the streets never stopped. A paper sword was added to the collection at the back of the mountain of the academy. It was sent from the South Jin Kingdom to the West Hill and finally came to the Tang Empire. The smell of fresh paint in the house by the Yanming Lake gradually dissipated. The young people in the house went further and further on the road of cultivation. Under the sharpening of talisman intent and sword chi, Sang Sang understood how to use the divine skill to fight. Yi Hongyu learned the Haoran sword and understood the thin paper sword more and more deeply. With a powerful person like the Tao addict as his goal, Ning Kei's progress was even more amazing. He became stronger and stronger. His current cultivation level had already stabilized at the upper level of the see-through realm, and he was resolutely walking upwards, getting closer and closer to the ravine that seemed to be the gap between heaven and man. One day, amidst the mist and heavy willows, he actually faintly saw that threshold. However, what made him feel slightly perplexed was that the threshold was somewhat frighteningly high for the current him. Spring passed, summer returned and autumn returned. When autumn returned to Chang'an, General Xiaohou, who had been stationed at the border of the Tang Empire for decades and made great achievements, was about to return to Chang'an. There are some more. I'm writing. I'm still asking for recommendation votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 454. According to the laws of the Tang Empire, the soldiers who had gone out to war had to return to Chang, and through the East City Gate. Hence, the meritorious post, which was more than 10 miles away from the East City Gate, became a very important place. Since the founding of the Tang Empire 1,000 years ago, countless famous generals and warriors had passed through this place with glory and achievements. The stables in the post and the poplar trees along the straight official road had witnessed many historical scenes with their own eyes. Xiahou looked at the majestic city in the west and remained silent. According to the rules of the imperial court, he and his subordinates had to spend the night in the Merit Inn. They would enter the city the next morning, and then go directly to the palace to see His Majesty. Chang'an looked extremely majestic in the twilight. The black and cyan city walls reflected the light of the setting sun, and glowed with a copper color. It looked indestructible and unusually magnificent. As one of the 4 most respected generals of the Tang Empire, Xiahou, who had been in the army for many years, naturally had deep feelings for Chang'an. However, not many people knew that although he often returned to the capital to report on his work and the general's mansion was in the North City, he did not spend much time in Chang'an. For decades, he had spent most of his time leading tens of thousands of cavalry to guard the cold northern borderline. He helped the empire to open up new territory and intimidate the cavalry of the Yin Kingdom and the left king's palace. Now that he had finally left the cold northern borderline, tens of thousands of cavalry were all left near the northeast border military camp in Tuyang City. The imperial court had already appointed General Shu to take over, so there should be no problem. Only a few dozen soldiers followed him back. The imperial court had explicitly allowed him to bring more soldiers back to Chang'an. However, he was very cautious on the eve of his retirement and did not do anything that might arouse the suspicion of the civil officials. In order to reassure the imperial court, Xiahou's 2 sons were still in Chang'an, imprisoned in the general's mansion. As for his legal wife, relatives, and loyal old servants, they had already returned to their hometown a few months ago. They cleaned up the old fields, took out pickles from the old cellar, and dried them in preparation for his retirement. Of course, that was not Xiahou's real hometown. His real hometown was in the cold region of the far north, which was the largest tribe of the Desolate Man. As the Desolate Man moved south, he could no longer return to his hometown. Perhaps it had been since the day he betrayed the Enlightenment doctrine. Gu Shi is dead. Lin Ling is dead. Many people who followed me back then are dead. As the sun set, the sky became darker and darker. The purple bronze city wall of Chang'an was gradually painted with an ominous blood-red color. Xiahou squinted at the wall and thought of his trusted subordinates, who had left him over the years at the cost of their deaths. He could not help but feel a little sad. In spring, the news of Huang Xing and Yu Shuiju's death spread from Chang'an to the military camp. This news did not make him sad, but made him a little vigilant. Sadness and vigilance were not emotions that an expert should have. Xiahou had been forcefully suppressing these emotions, so he began to feel tired and coughed in the twilight. The Great Tang military was a place that worshipped the strong. An ordinary general would never be willing to cough in front of his subordinates and reveal his weak side. But Xiahou did not care because he knew how powerful he was in the eyes of his subordinates, and he knew that he was still powerful. Defender General of the state Su Shi had been coughing for more than 10 years, but he was still the number 1 person in the Great Tang military. No one could replace his prestige or His Majesty's favor. Xiahou coughed repeatedly. Perhaps he thought that after entering Chang'an tomorrow, he would be unarmored and free from the last bit of fear, so he coughed very happily and even seemed a little presumptuous. The guard captain standing at the gate of the courier station looked at the broad figure of the general in front of him and listened to the coughing. His face revealed a worried expression. In his eyes, the general was indeed still powerful, But he had seen with his own eyes several battles between the general and the powerhouse from the devil's doctrine in the wilderness, so he was very worried. At this moment, the ground outside the wall of the courier station suddenly trembled a little. Neither the respectful low-ranking officials in the courier station nor Xia Ho's guard noticed this slight tremble. Although Xia Ho was a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts and one of the most powerful and terrifying men in the world, he was not a real god, so his cough could not make the ground tremble. He quietly looked at Chang and City under the sunset, then turned around and walked into the courier station. Someone was waiting for him in the room of the courier station. It was an extremely tall and burly man, even taller than Xia Ho by half a head. His expression was solemn and his figure was straight, like an indestructible mountain. This man wore a cloth robe, and under the thin material, traces of armor could be seen faintly. There was also a solemn aura of talisman inscriptions seeping out from the cloth. When Xia Ho stood in front of this mountain-like man, he was obviously shorter than the other party, but he felt more burly and stronger than the other party, so he did not need to raise his head. If people see Luo Kadi, the commander of the West Hill Divine Palace Divine Guards, suddenly appearing in the courier station closest to Chang'an City, they will definitely think that this is a provocation to the Tang Empire. He coldly looked at the man and said, "I know that you are a proud man, but do you really think that there are no powerhouses in the imperial center of the Tang Empire? In Chang'an City behind us there are at least 10 people who can easily kill you. Appearing in front of me at this time is completely courting death." Luo Kadi said, "Since I dared to come, naturally I am not afraid of death. In my opinion, General Xia Ho returning to Chang'an City is more like seeking death. Can you still come out alive?" Xia Ho's expression did not change, and he indifferently said, "In small countries like the South Jin, Song and Yu, your status in the Divine Hall can give you unlimited respect. But here in Chang'an City, in my eyes, you are just a dog raised by the hierarch. What right do you have to speak to me in such a tone?" A trace of anger flashed in the depths of Luo Kadi's eyes, but he forcibly suppressed it and said with a cold smile, "I admit that I am a dog raised by the hierarch lord, and you are a lion raised by Haotian. Now that you have lost your spirit, you still want to return to Chang'an City. Do you really want to make your enemy happy?" Xia Ho said in a low voice, "This is an agreement between me and the academy. Looking at the world, who dares to obstruct it? Even that master of yours does not have this ability. The Divine Hall is very happy to see General Xia Ho enjoy a happy old age, but are you really willing to do so?" Luo Kadi took out a letter with a rune fire seal and handed it over. He said, "This is a letter written by the hierarch lord himself. He invites you to West Hill. No, back to West Hill." Xia Ho took the letter, and his expression still did not change. Luo Kadi said, "The Divine Hall really needs your power. Furthermore, the hierarch lord has said that retiring does not mean that you have to live in the countryside forever. There will be a time when you will return." Xia Ho looked at him, and his two iron-like eyebrows slightly raised. He said, "What can you give me?" Luo Kadi said, "Since you are loyal to the Empress, then the West Hill Divine Palace promises that in the future, in the fight for the throne of the Tang Empire, the Divine Hall will do its best to help the Empress's prince succeed." With the terrifying power of the West Hill Divine Palace, it was a very sincere invitation for Xia Ho to throw out such a heavy bet a long time in advance. However, to Luo Kadi's surprise, in the face of the hierarch lord's sincerity, Xia Ho did not show the expected emotional reaction. Instead, he said directly, "I won't see you out." Luo Kadi suppressed his anger and said, "The Divine Hall needs an answer." Xia Ho said, "I am very grateful, and I will seriously consider it. That is my answer." The ground of the Merit Post House trembled slightly again. Luo Kadi left quietly. The officials and people in Chang'an, and who were preparing for the welcoming ceremony, would probably never know that the West Hill Divine Palace's Divine Guard commander had once come to Chang'an and tried to lead General Xia Ho to another path. Looking at the letter written by the West Hill hierarch, Xia Ho's face revealed a mocking smile. He knew that this was indeed a letter written by the hierarch lord. Over the years, he had received 7 letters written by the hierarch lord, and was very familiar with the handwriting on the cover. He was mocking the intention of the West Hill Divine Palace to help the Empress's own prince ascend to the throne of the Tang Empire. If the West Hill Divine Palace knew that the Empress was his most beloved sister, Xia Tian, and that the prince had half the blood of the desolate flowing in him and the aura of the Enlightenment doctrine, would the bigwigs in the Divine Hall still dare to do this? The mocking smile on Xia Ho's face slowly turned into a self-deprecating one. His fingers slightly tightened, ready to crush the letter written by the hierarch lord into powder. However, for some reason, he hesitated for a moment before stopping. General Xia Ho, who had been stationed in the northern borderline for the Tang Empire for decades, did not raise any conditions and was willing to retire. The officials in the imperial court felt a little strange, but immediately felt much more relaxed. After asking for His Majesty's orders, the imperial court gave the general the highest treatment and honor. In the early morning, under the warm guidance of the officials from the Ministry of Rights and the respectful gazes of the Yulin royal guards, Xia Ho put on a new set of armor and rode towards Chang, and with dozens of bodyguards. The official rode in front of the east gate of Chang, and had long been washed clean. In the solemn music, Princely Peiyin of the Tang Empire led the civil and military officials out of the city to wait. Countless celebrities in the city were also waiting eagerly. The imperial court had already drafted the edict and was waiting for Xia Ho to enter the palace to have an audience with him. At this time, the edict was quietly placed in the palace, with dazzling rewards and titles of nobility. Looking at the dense welcoming crowd from afar, Xia Ho disregarded the advice of the officials from the Ministry of Rights and dismounted in advance. He pulled Ma Jiang and walked in that direction. Seeing this scene, the prince smiled and shook his head. He waved away the eunuch beside him who was trying to dissuade him and walked towards him at the same time. The two met in front of the departure pavilion outside the east gate. Xia Ho calmly saluted to the prince. Li Peiyin found it difficult to calm down. Looking at his dark face, he sighed and said, "It's good that you're back." The officials of the Tang Empire did not like General Xia Ho, who was famous for his arrogance and violence. For decades, there had been rumors that Xia Ho had killed prisoners of war and innocent people to pass off his military exploits. No one knew how many laws of the Tang Empire had been violated. However, there had been no evidence. Moreover, everyone knew that this general was highly regarded by the Empress, which meant that he was also highly regarded by the Emperor. Perhaps for this reason, the people of Chang and did not sincerely love General Xia Ho like they did the other three generals of the empire. Although Xia Ho did not kill the Tangs indiscriminately, the simple and direct people of Chang and always felt that violence was not a real ability. After all, Xia Ho had guarded the bitter northern frontier for decades for the empire. Today he had retired, but he was still warmly welcomed by the people of Chang, and the crowds on both sides of the street cheered and applauded from time to time. There was a tea house on the side of the street. The shopkeeper and waiters of the tea house all ran to the street to welcome the return of the general. No one cared about the business at all. Fortunately, there were not many customers in the tea house at this time. Ning Ke and Sang Sang sat at the table by the window. He listened to the cheers and applause from the street and looked at the back of Xia Ho, who had just ridden past the tea house. After a moment of silence, he said, "Compared to when he was in Tuyang City, he really has aged a lot. If I finish it today, I will finish it for this month. I suddenly feel relaxed just like Xia Ho today. There won't be many updates tomorrow, because my father-in-law and mother-in-law have come back from Yinchuan for a vacation. I will go back to my parents' home with the leaders. Please continue to cast your monthly votes and recommendation votes to support me. At midnight, I will send a special chapter to ask for monthly votes. Friends who have updates to remind you, please forgive me if it disturbs your sleep." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to cast your recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 455. Ning Ke had met Xia Ho for the first time by the Hulun Sea last year. Later, they had a close encounter in Tuyang City. At that time, although Xia Ho had failed in the fight for the Ming Handscroll of the Tomes of Arcane and was forced to reach an agreement with the Academy to retire, he was still calm and confident, and even had a hidden aggressiveness. However, Xiahou had obviously aged a little today. Although he was wearing a brand new armor, his eyes were still cold and indifferent, and his body was still tall and straight like a mountain. Ning Ke could faintly smell the musty odor of a damp woodshed for many years coming from this general. Although the news that Xiahou had been repeatedly assassinated by the powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine in the wilderness was strictly kept secret by the Tang military ministry, it still gradually spread and naturally reached Ning Ke's ears. The Devil's Doctrine's method of eliminating traitors is more direct and powerful than I thought. Ning Ke looked at the back of Xiahou, who was covered by the crowd in the distance. He thought that if Xiahou's armor was really destroyed by the giant knife in Tang's hands, his originally extremely pitiful hope of success might be a little luckier. Xiahou was an imperial general with a glorious title. He was not someone like Censor Zhang Yiqi or Huang Xing, who could be easily assassinated. The most critical problem was that Xiahou was still so powerful even though he was getting older. It was basically impossible for Ning Ke to assassinate him without leaving any evidence. The imperial court and the academy tacitly allowed Xiahou to retire peacefully. No one knew what the West Hill was thinking. In short, Ning Ke seemed to have countless backers, but in front of Xiahou, these backers would not help at all. So under such circumstances, how could he kill Xiahou? In the 15th year of the Tang Tianqi era, a plan gradually formed in Ning Ke's mind. However, every time he thought of this plan, even he himself felt that it was a little ridiculous because no matter how he looked at it, there was no possibility of success. If others such as Li Yu Yihongyu or Chen Pipi knew the true content of his plan, they would think that there must be something wrong with his brain. In the whole world, probably only second brother and Chao Shaoshu would agree. Sang Sang held her chin and looked at the crowd below the tea house. She suddenly turned her head and looked at Ning Ke with a worried expression. She said, "Why are you so anxious?" Ning Ke said, "I've been waiting for 15 years. I think I'm very patient." Sang Sang said seriously, "Let's wait until he's older and we're stronger. Let's wait for him to retire in the countryside for a few years. Won't we be more confident then?" Since she was a child, Ning Ke did not want her to think about those bloody and cruel things, but it did not mean that he did not teach her. In fact, whether in Min Mountain or on the grassland outside the city of Wei, he had been instilling a certain concept in the little handmaiden. No matter the enemy was old, weak, women or children, as long as she could defeat the enemy, no matter how shameless it was, no matter how sad it was, she had to endure it until the most confident moment before she took action. Once she took action, she had to kill the enemy. Ning Ke smiled and said, "If we don't kill them now, Xiahou will really be old." Sang Sang asked in confusion, "Isn't that good?" Ning Ke said, "When he's older, I'm more confident to kill him. But I'm worried that what if he dies of illness? What if he really dies of old age?" Sang Sang did not understand, thinking that if Xiahou died of old age and illness, what was the problem? She asked, "Isn't that good?" Ning Ke nodded and said, "Very bad." Sang Sang frowned slightly and asked why. "Because Xiahou is not my enemy." After a short pause, Ning Ke continued calmly, "He is my enemy." At this moment, the shopkeeper and waiters of the tea house returned to the tea house, excitedly talking about the troops they had seen on the street, and admiring the power of General Xiahou. Ning Ke quietly listened to the discussion in the tea house and shook his head. The enemy can die from natural disasters and man-made disasters, tsunamis and rivers. As long as he no longer stands in our way, blocks our way, and destroys our business, it doesn't matter even if he chokes to death while eating or stinks to death while going to the toilet. But the enemy is different. When it comes to things like revenge, if it is dragged on for too long, it will gradually ferment and evolve into something else. Compared to killing the other party and making them pay for what happened in the past, the more important thing is to kill the other party so that they can forget what happened in the past and obtain true freedom. He looked at Sang Sang and said, "But whether it is to let the enemy pay the price or to get relief, the most important thing is to kill the enemy. And he must die in the hands of the enemy. He can't die by himself, he can't be killed by God, and he can't die in bed." Ning Ke thought of that rainy year in the eastern city of Chang, and the old blacksmith in the blacksmith shop who died with his eyes open, and his white hair wet by the rain. He looks slightly lost. He can't even be old, sick, or haggard. It is best to be at the peak of his life. Only in this way can he bring enough pleasure to the enemy. And this is the key to revenge. Xiahou is already old. Ningke solemnly repeated what he had said before. If he is not killed, he will really be old. General Xiahou returned to Chang, and first entered the palace to see His Majesty. Then he received the title of nobility from His Majesty in the court meeting, and the respect of the courtiers. After the meeting, he declined the invitations of several courtiers, and went to the military ministry with his bodyguards to handle military affairs. He stayed in the small building in the meadow beside the Vermilion Bird Avenue for the whole afternoon. It was said that he had a long talk with General Su Shi, the military leader of the Tang Empire. The twilight gradually faded and the night shrouded Chang, and Xiahou left the military ministry. His bodyguards rode on horses with torches and escorted him to the solemn and luxurious prince's mansion in the northern city. The prince's mansion was brightly lit in the night. After an ordinary but old family banquet, Prince Li Peiyan of the Tang Empire took him to the study. On the black desk there were a few scrolls. The handwriting on the scrolls varied, and it was obvious that they were not written at the same time. There were some names written on the scrolls, and beside the names, there were detailed notes written in small block letters. Zhangyiqi Chen Zixian Yen Suqing Linling Gu Shi Huang Xing Yushui Zhu. These names were either noble or humble officials, civilians or soldiers. But they all had two characteristics in common. First, these people used to be members of the Tang Empire's military. Second, these people were all dead. Li Peiyan looked at the names on the files. After a long silence he said indifferently, "These people are all dead, so it means that some people who should have died are still alive." Xiahou looked at a name on the file and said expressionlessly, "This person did not participate in it. He participated in the incident in the Yin territory." Li Peiyan sighed and pushed the files on the desk aside. He looked at Xiahou and said worriedly, "Although there is no evidence, these names and the stories behind them can prove that our worries are right. There are indeed people in the Xianwei general's mansion who are still alive." Hearing the name Lin Guangyan, Xiahou's two thin eyebrows slowly frowned. Of course he remembered who Lin Guangyan was. More than a decade ago, there was a Xianwei general in the Tang Empire's military who was famous for his bravery. That general's name was Lin Guangyan. At that time, many people thought that Lin Guangyan was another brave general of the Tang Empire after Xiahou. In the first year of the Tang Empire's Tianqi era, Xiahou killed Lin Guangyan's whole family. It was not because he did not like to be compared with this general. Although he was known for being overbearing and violent, he did not have the interest and hobby of killing people's whole families. Xiahou narrowed his eyes slightly and his expression was a little complicated. It was not because he felt guilty for the Xianwei general. He had killed too many people in his life and had done more cruel and cold-blooded things. It was nothing to kill a general's whole family. However, when the Prince Palace mentioned the name Lin Guangyan, it reminded him of many things in the past. More than a decade ago, the Empress passed away due to illness. The families in Qinghe County were eager to take action. His Majesty took the concubine named Xia Tian to travel south to the Great Swamp and watch over the disaster. Xiahou received the secret edict from His Majesty and secretly returned to Cha, and from Tuyang City with thousands of cavalrymen to guard the rear for His Majesty, and assist the prince to temporarily oversee the court affairs. He also received a secret edict from the West Hill Divine Palace. In the face of the secret edict from the West Hill Divine Palace, he was at the peak of his life and wanted to continue to enjoy the respect of the people. Therefore, he calmly accepted the other party's request. There was a bloody storm in Chang, and the whole Xianwei general's mansion was killed. Xiahou knew that by doing this, he would anger the emperor who was touring the Great Marsh. However, he believed that with his achievements, no matter how angry the emperor was, it was impossible for him to act against him without evidence. Moreover, he faintly hoped that in his anger, the emperor would not confer the title of empress to that concubine called Xia Xia. He did not want his sister to become the empress of the Tang Empire because he knew that it was a very dangerous thing. However, he did not expect that His Majesty still let his sister become the empress. Compared to these stories, How much blood and dust had stained the stone lions in front of the Xianwei general's mansion had never moved Xiahou, let alone made him sad. In the study of the prince's mansion, Li Peiyan looked at Xiahou and said bitterly, "It is not a big deal that Lin Guangyun still has descendants in the world. But if the son of the general who is determined to avenge him has become the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy and Mr. 13 of the second floor of the academy, it will be troublesome." Xiahou was silent for a moment and said, "Your Highness, you mean, Ning Ke is Lin Guangyun's son?" Li Peiyan sighed and said, "I don't want to admit that it is true, but there is no other explanation except this. I personally supervise the execution of the Xianwei general's mansion. According to the law of the Tang Empire, there were very few people who could be exempted from punishment. They were all temporary hires without contract documents, so it is impossible for anyone to escape." Xiahou looked at the slightly swaying candle on the desk and said expressionlessly, "Lin Guangyun only had 2 sons. Their characteristics were all recorded in the book, and I personally checked them." Li Peiyan said, "Then it means that someone did something." Xiahou said indifferently, "Even if Ning Ke is Lin Guangyun's son, what can he do?" Rubbing my hands, I will write 1 chapter today and 2 chapters tomorrow. This is the first day of the month. Everyone should vote for it. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 456. Xiahou's expression was very cold, like the snow that could be seen outside of Tuyang City until late spring. His lips were as thin as iron, and his voice was naturally calm and domineering. The prince's revelation of Ning Ke's possible identity did not make the general vigilant, because he had absolute confidence in this matter. Li Peiyan was probably infected by his expression at this time. He thought that in the absence of evidence, it was impossible for anyone to reverse the verdict of the Xianwei general's treason case. His brother did not do anything back then, and he would not do anything now. As for whether Ning Ke would deal with Xiahou like how he dealt with the dead in the file, it was not something that the 2 bigwigs in the study would worry about because he did not have the ability to do so. Although Ning Ke was now a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, and had a special status as Mr. 13 of the academy, Mr. 13 was after all Mr. 13, not Mr. 1st or Mr. 2nd. Even Mr. 1st and Mr. 2nd did not have the confidence to defeat General Xiahou, let alone Ning Quebec. Li Peiyan said calmly, "The Imperial Court and old General Su Shi have investigated Ning Ke's background, and I have naturally done the same. Looking at his past these years, Ning Ke is a cold and ruthless person, but he is smart and knows his limits. He is very good at forbearance, and he would never act rashly when he is not sure. Under the circumstances that the Academy has reached an agreement with you, he will definitely continue to forbearance because he is not powerful enough." He patted Xiahou's shoulder and comforted him. "As long as the real super-mundane people in the Academy do not take action, who in Chong and can do anything to you?" Xiahou looked at the candle on the table and slightly frowned. He said, "The West Hill has looked for me." Li Peiyan's expression became slightly serious. He looked at his eyes and said slowly, "You must understand that the Imperial Court has found a rare opportunity to seize the Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane. The Academy is willing to allow you to leave safely. This opportunity is fleeting, and it is not wise for you to hesitate at this time." Xiahou was silent for a long time. Then he said in a low voice, "Everyone in the world understands this. However, there are many people who are absolutely unwilling to see me leave Chong and city like this." Li Peiyan thought of the news he had just received. He could not help but raise his eyebrows slowly. After a sigh he said, "You are right. People from Qinghe County have also come. Those old things seem to have smelled something and want to stir up trouble. At a time like this we should bear with it for a few days. No one in the Imperial Court, including His Majesty, likes the people from Qinghe County. Xiahou said, if necessary before I leave, I can kill a few more people for the Imperial Court." Of course, that is with His Majesty's permission. Li Peiyan thought of his royal brother. who was completely different from the emperors in the history books. A bitter smile appeared on his face. The law is before us. How could His Majesty easily make such an exception? Xiahou said. Then let those fellows from Qinghe County live for a few more days. However, if they still try to stir up Her Majesty's mood, don't blame me for disregarding the law of the Tang Empire and being ruthless. Li Pan said, of course. If those fellows still do not understand the relationship between His Majesty and Her Majesty, they are courting death. Xiahou said. Then I will leave first. Li Peiyan said. Since the two young masters returned to the capital last year, they have been locked up in the general's mansion and did not interact with the court officials. I know this must be your intention. However, since you are back now, why do you still lock up the children so uncomfortably? Accompany me to the House of Red Sleeves to watch the song and dance. Let them come too. Xiahou said, I still have things to do tomorrow. I will come and drink with your highness after I finish them. Li Peiyan's expression changed slightly. He thought, you have already entered the palace today. What else do you have to do in Chang'an City? You know very well that the two young masters Xiahou locked themselves in the general's mansion. Before His Majesty's decree comes down, you should remain silent. What is there tomorrow that you are not afraid of breaking the taboo? Xiahou walked to the door of the study and stopped. He said, I will invite Ningke to drink tomorrow. Li Peiyan was slightly shocked. He looked at him and said, what are you going to do? Don't forget his identity. Although he can't do anything to you if you harm him, will the academy still remain silent? Xiahou said, I dare to drink with him. I dare to invite him, but I want to see if he dares to come. Because of the fight for the Ming handscroll of the tomes of arcane in the wilderness, General Xiahou had offended the academy, which made His Majesty even angrier. However, this person had tens of thousands of cavalry under his command. He had opened up new territories for the Tang Empire. He was powerful and had meritorious military service. It was very troublesome for the imperial court to deal with him. After Mr. First of the Academy personally went to Tuyang City to talk with Xiahou, General Xiahou accepted the proposal to retire without hesitation with an extremely strong will. This was the ending that the Tang Empire most wanted to see. Whether it was the palace, the military, or the court officials, they were all extremely satisfied. That was why they gave Xiahou the highest honor and treatment. However, there was never anyone or anything in the world that could satisfy everyone. Under the glory of Haotian, there was still the devil's doctrine. Before the mountains of the academy, there were still people who were not very respectful to the headmaster. Naturally, Xiahou could not do this. Ningke was not satisfied with this ending, and neither was the West Hill. The emperor and the people of the Yan kingdom, who had been bullied by Xiahou's cavalry for decades and had been silently waiting for the Tang Empire to fall out with each other and for Xiahou to become a miserable cook dog, were also not satisfied. Even in the Tang Empire, some big powers were extremely disappointed. That power was the families of Qinghe County that His Highness had mentioned. Qinghe County was located in the southeast of the Tang Empire. It was rich and prosperous. Since ancient times, no one knew how many bigwigs had been cultivated there. Among them, the Cui, Chan, and Song families were the leaders. They were known as the 7 families of Qinghe County. The 7 families of Qinghe County were, in fact, 7 aristocratic families. They had a long history, even before the founding of the Tang Empire. Even the great divine priests of the West Hill Divine Palace were from these 7 aristocratic families. 1,000 years ago, the Tang Empire was founded with its cavalry. Its soldiers swept across the world. The West Hill Divine Palace secretly ordered all countries to join forces to resist, but they could not stop the birth and rise of this superpower. However, under such circumstances, Qinghe County, which was still in the southeast of the Tang Empire, was still under the strong protection of the 7 aristocratic families. It faced the pressure of Chang, and calmly and maintained political and economic independence. This situation lasted for more than a decade. The Tang Empire's cavalry went north to the grassland and defeated the desolate man tribes that made the people of the Central Plains tremble. They even successfully forced the desolate man to leave the grassland and move to the cold region in the far north. The prestige of Chang and rose to an unprecedented and rare level in history. The hearts of the people gradually moved to the west. It was only then that the 7 families of Qinghe County finally decided to surrender. When the Tang Empire was founded, there were many things to do. There were many annexed counties that needed to be digested, and the people needed to recuperate. The 7 families of Qinghe County were too famous in the world. Therefore, the Taizu, who once used the power of the whole country to kill Qian Li and destroy a tribe in the grassland because a small village was massacred, took a rare conciliatory policy towards Qinghe County. He made this a national policy and recorded it in his posthumous edict. In the early years of the Tang Empire, the academy in the south of Chang had just been built. There were very few students and the imperial court chose officials through the imperial examinations. Compared to the many counties that had just learned to read and write, the culturally prosperous Qinghe County could naturally benefit the most from the imperial examinations. In those years, the clansmen and students from Qinghe County entered Cha, and through the imperial examinations, nearly half of the candidates came from Qinghe County. The officials in the imperial court of Chang, and the important positions in the temples were all controlled by the 7 families of Qinghe County. Because of the national policy established in the posthumous edict of the Taizu Emperor, the Tang imperial family treated Qinghe County with great respect. They often arranged marriages and even had 3 generations of empresses from the 7 families of Qinghe County. Sometimes there were sages who were worried and said that if this went on, it would be hard to tell whether the Tang Empire was the Tang Empire of the Li family or the Tang Empire of the Qinghe County. It turned out that the Tang Empire, which conquered the world by waving a padao on horseback, could not be conquered just because of the rule of law. The successive emperors in the early years of the Tang Empire all followed the style of their ancestors. They ruled while sitting on the dragon throne, but they firmly held the powerful military power in their sleeves. Nearly 900 years ago, in the 4th year of Songhua, the Tang Emperor was only 14 years old. Under the pressure of his mother and the court officials, he kept quiet for 4 years and studied for 4 years. Just 2 years before he took over the government, the young emperor did not hesitate to reach out his thin hand from his sleeves when his mother, who was surnamed Song from Qinghe County, tried to violate the posthumous edict of the late emperor and let his uncle, the Grand Secretary Song, who was also the prime minister, take over the military power. That hand held the military power, and the military power was a cold and merciless knife. That night, a light cavalry came out of the imperial city and went straight to the mansion of the Grand Secretary Song in the northern city. Blood flowed like a river in the mansion, and it was a tragic sight. The next day, countless officials cried blood and kowtowed to the imperial court, accusing the emperor of being cruel and heartless. The young emperor sat on the dragon throne and calmly, or rather indifferently, listened to the news that came from the palace gate. Then he waved his hand tiredly. The waving did not mean that he was backing down, because the young emperor did not issue an edict of his own crimes, but directly used the cane. That day, outside the palace, 148 officials of the imperial court were beaten to death by the cane. Their blood stained their official robes and the green ground, which seemed to be even darker than the palace walls. That night, the young emperor came to the academy in the southern suburbs of Cha, and under the protection of the bodyguards and the Yulin royal guards. No one knew what he said to someone in the academy that night, but the next day with a decree the Empress Dowager, who thought that she was more ambitious than the previous empresses of Qinghe County, was imprisoned in the cold palace. Since then no one had seen her. In the following period of time, officials from Qinghe County and various counties and states of the Tang Empire either submitted petitions to beg for forgiveness and loyalty, or were arrested by the secret guards and brought back to the capital to be imprisoned. For a time countless heads fell to the ground, and a gloomy cloud floated over the entire empire. People were panicking. The turmoil in the imperial court and political affairs naturally caused serious damage to the power of the Tang Empire. However, the young emperor was like the ancestors of the Li family. At this moment he showed a strong will that did not care about the world being destroyed. He did not hesitate to continue purging anyone who dared to oppose him. After this incident, the essence that Qinghe County had accumulated for decades was completely destroyed, and the power of the 7 families was seriously damaged. More importantly, The proud and confident aristocratic families finally understood a principle. No matter how brilliant their surnames were, no matter how long the history of their families, as long as they dared to cross that line, they were still just little white rabbits under the butcher's knife in the eyes of the Li royal family. There is one more chapter today. In addition, if I do not say that there is more in the future, then there is really no more. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 457. The blood and skulls of their clansmen woke the Qinghe County families up from their stupor. Especially in this chaos, no matter how much they tried to stir up public opinion, they still could not gain the sympathy of the people. They only attracted the disgust and disdain of the people, which shocked them even more. In the years that followed, they discovered even more shocking things. Those who were chosen to be sent to Chang and to be empress were the most outstanding and intelligent women of the Qinghe County families. They had received many years of education in their families. However, other than the Empress Dowager Song, who had been imprisoned during the Songhua period, all the empresses were known for being virtuous and quiet in the Chang, an imperial palace. They were extremely silent when it came to court matters and rarely spoke up for the Qinghe County families. It was only then that the families realized that these intelligent empresses had already understood the general trend of the world. No country could escape the laws of history, and the invincible Tang Empire was no exception. With the long period of peace and the impossibility of endless wars, this big empire gradually became rigid and decayed with the passage of time. However, for some reason, compared to the glorious empires recorded in the history books of Qinghe County, this law of history had a much weaker effect on the Tang Empire. The speed at which the empire became rigid and decayed was very slow. Every time a major change was about to happen, there seemed to be some kind of force in the dark that would fix the overturned carriage of the Tang Empire and forcibly drag it back to the right path. As the Tang Empire grew stronger, the majesty of the royal family became more and more unshakable. After many years of suppression, the people of Qinghe County had long returned. Most importantly, the academy had quietly replaced part of the role of the imperial examinations. The families of Qinghe County no longer had the supreme glory they had 1,000 years ago, and their power and authority were much weaker than before. But the families of Qinghe County were, after all, families of thousands of generations. As they sincerely surrendered and changed their attitude towards Chang, they gradually returned to the stage of the world with the tacit consent of the royal family. Today, the families of Qinghe County still had power that could not be underestimated in the imperial court. They also worshipped many scholars. Although they were still far from military power, no one knew if there was a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state, hidden in the depths of these secluded ancestral temples of thousands of generations. Therefore, even today, it was still the most beautiful dream of many men to be able to marry the daughter of the Qinghe River. The first wife of Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library, was the daughter of the Chui clan of the Qinghe River. However, how could the families of Qinghe County, who once had limitless glory in the world, who once occupied most of the seats in the court, and who had produced several West Hill divine priests, be reconciled to the current situation? The aristocratic families were a cold existence. They instinctively wanted to seize more benefits. Therefore, although they did not dare to rebel and were so low-key that they were almost forgotten by the world, they still yearned to have a higher status and more power in the Tang Empire. Over the past few centuries, Qinghe County had produced another 9 empresses. This was the result of their efforts. More than a decade ago, they had tried to make Qinghe County have another empress. At that time, the current emperor had just ascended the throne, and the empress had unfortunately died of illness. The eyes of the Qinghe County officials were bloodshot. They were like vultures staring at rotten meat. They used all the power in the imperial court and the countryside to send the most outstanding and intelligent girl of the 7 families to the palace. After some planning and spending a lot of money, the emperor finally met the girl, and then a heart-stirring story was born. However, the Qinghe County officials had racked their brains to create this seemingly beautiful situation. However, They did not know that a bigwig named Lotus had already started a similar plan before them. Lotus won, and the saintess of the diabolism became the current empress. Lotus also lost because the empress fell in love and had long forgotten the mission of the diabolism. The Qinghe County officials were even more defeated. Not only did they lose their hopes, but they had also seriously offended the empress, which was equivalent to offending the prince and General Xiahou. The only one who had truly won was the emperor. Although the dukes of Qinghe County had lost badly, the fact that they dared to plot this showed the strength and confidence of these families. One must know that the Zhong family, which was the most powerful in Yangguan City, was only the weakest of the 7 families in Qinghe County. For more than a decade, because they had offended the empress and other bigwigs in Chong and City, the families in Qinghe County became more and more low-key. Especially the elders in the family, they did not dare to enter the capital. This situation only changed after the imperial astronomer made the famous night curtain covering the stars. Everyone knew that the Tang emperor and the empress had a deep relationship, and the empress still looked radiant. She must be in good health and would not die early. Naturally, the East Palace would not have a chance to change hands to Qinghe County. However, fortunately, the emperor still had a very favored princess. Now, the families in Qinghe County could not be on good terms with the empress, so naturally they began to support the princess without hesitation. More accurately, they supported the Prince Li Huiyuan whom the princess assisted. In a quiet mansion in the southern city of Chang'an, a calm old man sat in the study of the backyard. This old man's surname was Song, and he was a minister of offerings in the Song clan. Even in the imperial court he had an official status. 20 years ago, Minister of Offerings Song was a visiting professor in the Imperial Center Administration. However, he knew very well that this status was more of a reward from the imperial court to the Song clan in Qinghe County. Therefore, he had never cared about the affairs of the Imperial Center Administration, and had never even entered Chang'an City. However, he finally came today. General Xiahou was about to retire, and the power of the empress seemed to have been severely weakened. However, in the eyes of the dukes of Qinghe County, this move had successfully resolved all the conflicts that had accumulated over the past decades. They did not want to see Xiahou leave Chang'an City with a smile. Censor Songku stood respectfully in front of the old man and said bitterly, "Third ancestor, the imperial court has already made a decision. Everyone knows His Majesty's intentions. No matter how we persuade him now, there are not many colleagues who are willing to submit a petition with me. Although it is not wrong to spread rumors, this matter involves the general, and we have to be careful." Minister Song frowned and thought of the glory of his family in the imperial court. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Back then, the General Xian was a member of the family, and contacting a dozen censors to submit a petition was a small matter. It was not as difficult as it is now. Don't make it too difficult. If it doesn't work, then forget it." Censor Song did not dare to say more, but his expression was clearly much more relaxed. "Now it seems that we can only pin our hopes on Mr. 13. The old Minister of Offerings said expressionlessly, "If this really happens, the Academy will definitely break off relations with General Xiahou. By then, how can the Empress' son ascend to the throne?" Censor Song was not a cultivator. Although he knew that many ministers in the imperial court came from the academy, he still could not understand what the old ancestor was saying. He thought to himself, what right does the academy have to decide the succession of the throne? The old minister of offerings sighed and said, Mr. 13 was not afraid of the laws of the Tang Empire. He killed Huang Xing and Yu Shuizhu on the rainy street because he was strong enough and was confident that no one would be able to use against him. However, in front of Xiahou, the strong and the weak are easy to deal with. If I were him, I would not know how to do it either. No matter how fast his state improved in the past 2 years, he is still no match for Xiahou. Xiahou can kill him with one finger. Censor Song was confused and asked subconsciously, should we help Mr. 13 in secret? The old minister of offerings glanced at him and slightly furrowed his white eyebrows. He lectured, Xiahou is the academy's method. If Ningke forcefully breaks the rules, the academy will not help him, but they will not stop him either. The most likely scenario is that they will watch quietly from the side. However, that is because Ning-Kei is a student of the headmaster of the academy. If we interfere in this matter, do you really think that the academy will not dare to do anything to Qinghe County? Censor Song smiled awkwardly. In his heart he thought, if the family does not dare to interfere in this matter, then there is no reason for you to come to Chang'an City. The old minister of offerings guessed what his distant nephew was thinking, but he did not give any explanation. He slowly closed his eyes. He did not need to pretend to be mysterious at this moment because he was really thinking hard about how to defeat Xiahou on behalf of Mr. 13 of the academy. If Ning-Kei did not understand, then this battle would never happen. If the old minister of offerings did not understand, then the families of Qinghe County and Her Highness would not be able to benefit from this matter. The confusion of the officials of Qinghe County was also the confusion of many people in Chang'an City. As the rumors of Ning-Kei's parentage spread within a very limited range, the bigwigs in the imperial palace and the mansions of princes and dukes were all frowning and thinking about what Ning-Kei would do without the support of the academy. Those bigwigs who had vaguely guessed the inside story, like His Highness the Prince, were not fooled by Ning-Kei's seemingly frivolous and roguish disguise. They all knew that Ning-Kei had strong self-control, was very rational, and even appeared cold and heartless because of his rationality. At a time when there was no hope, logically speaking, Ning-Kei should not do anything. The bigwigs thought hard for a long time for Ning-Kei, but they could not find any hope. Therefore, they gradually relaxed and felt that Chang'an City would be peaceful this autumn. There would not be any problems between the academy and the military. At this moment, a piece of news from the general's mansion spread to the imperial palace and also to the mansions of the princes and dukes. It made these bigwigs confused and uneasy. General Xiahou had invited Mr. 13 of the academy, Ning-Kei, to his mansion tonight. In the house by the Yanming Lake, Yi Hongyu looked at Ning-Kei, who was in the shadow of the locust tree. She looked at his expression and suddenly said, "Now I know why you need power." Ning-Kei said, "You are indeed the Grand Master of the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall. You escaped from the Peach Mountain and lived in seclusion in Chang'an City, but you still receive such secret information." Yi Hongyu said, "Of course you must avenge your father's death, but now is obviously the most inappropriate time. You can't even beat me now, how can you kill Xiahou?" Ning-Kei said, "When did I say that I wanted to kill Xiahou?" Feeling. Yi Hongyu said calmly, "This autumn lake, the house by the lake, Song-Song's cooking, your breath, and the smell of the garden all tell me that you are preparing to kill." Ning-Kei shook his head and said, "Killing is against the law of the Tang Empire. Teacher and eldest brother do not allow me to do so." Yi Hongyu said, "Then why do you still want to go to the banquet?" Ning-Kei said with a smile, "Why should I not go if I can eat for free? I can't beat him now, nor can I kill him, so I can only eat all the delicacies in the general's mansion. It can be considered as revenge." Yi Hongyu naturally did not believe his words. She said, "If there is really a dispute between you and Xiahou, the Divine Hall will benefit a lot from it, so I will not stop you." Ning-Kei said, "I asked Sang-Sang to prepare supper, so I will come back alive." After writing these 2 chapters, I suddenly felt that my mind was as empty as a wild field. I was shocked and frightened, so I hurried to organize the details of the later chapters. I know it is taboo, but I can't help but say that I have not been in a good state these days. What I wrote feels a little long-winded. I want to correct it, so I will start from the next chapter. I will try my best to think about it. Please continue to support me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 458. The general's mansion did not prepare any delicacies for tonight's banquet. The long square table set between the autumn trees in the courtyard was dark in color. There were some very ordinary dishes on it, but it had its own solemn atmosphere. There were not many servants and maidservants serving at the table. Serving the dishes was actually done by the 2 young masters Xiahou. Such a scene was completely different from the extravagance of General Xiahou in the rumors. At this time, probably the entire Chang and city was paying attention to this banquet. However, the atmosphere at the banquet was not as hostile as people imagined. Xiahou and Ning Ke, who sat opposite each other at the long table, just ate in silence and occasionally talked about the scenery of the wilderness and their encounters at the front gate. The simple banquet very simply came to an end. The maidservants filed in and quietly took away the leftovers on the long table. Then they served 2 plates of blue teapots. The 2 young masters Xiahou served the first cup of tea to Ning Ke, and then very politely bid farewell. They walked out of the garden and asked all the maidservants and stewards to stay far away. Then they quietly guarded the garden gate. The teapot and the teacup were the same color as the blue sky. It was rather spacious but warm and not eye-catching. The tea was black fir tea, which was also very mild. Even the temperature of the tea was just right at this time. Ning Ke attentively looked at the teapot and slowly reached out to touch the teacup. Then, he raised his head and looked at Xiahou at the other end of the long table. He was as focused and serious as he was when he looked at the teapot a moment ago. It was just like when he first saw Princely Peiyan in front of the hall of the academy 2 years ago. It was as if he wanted to burn Xiahou's face into his own eyes. Xiahou looked at the large piece of black fir tea in the cup that rose and fell in the slightly heavy warm well water. He knew that Ning Ke was staring at him. A slightly mocking smile slowly appeared at the corner of his mouth. He said, "Do you want to see clearly what your enemy looks like? You were not so presumptuous in Tuyang City." Ning Ke did not deny what he said, nor did he admit it. His fingers gently turned the small sky blue teacup and said, "In Tuyang City, the person I respected was eldest brother, not you." Hearing this, Xiahou slowly raised his head. As he moved, the black fur in the teacup seemed to be suddenly hit and sank to the bottom of the cup. Ning Ke lowered his head. Xiahou looked at him expressionlessly. The autumn wind suddenly rose in the courtyard, and the treetops rustled. Countless yellow leaves of different shades were blown off the branches and landed on the long table and the ground in front of the 2 people. If it had been someone else, facing General Xiahou's strong coercion and the killing intent brought by the autumn wind and yellow leaves, and thinking of the deep hatred between the 2, even if they were not afraid, they would probably feel a little nervous. However, Ning Ke was not. There was not even a trace of expression on his face. Xiahou looked into his eyes. Without any warning, he suddenly asked, "Are you Lin Guangyuan's son?" Ning Ke looked at the darkening tea in the cup and shook his head. The autumn wind, carrying with it an austere aura, continued to linger in the courtyard, brushing off more leaves. Then it brushed the yellow leaves on the table to the ground, and the yellow leaves on the ground to the surroundings. Xiahou said, "I have killed many people in my life. I don't care." Ning Ke finally raised his head and looked at him, saying, "General is mighty." The yellow leaves on the ground were blown around by the autumn wind and did not stop until they reached the corner of the wall. It looked like the waves of a lake hitting against the embankment. Xiahou said, "Hatred sometimes has to be resolved even if it can't be resolved." The leaves piled up higher and higher in the corner of the courtyard. The leaves on the top rustled down and were blown up again by the autumn wind that still occupied the ground. The austere autumn wind did not give the leaves any chance to escape. Just like the conversation at this time, Xiahou said 3 sentences. They seemed to have no connection with each other, but they were extremely strong and pressed forward step by step, not giving Ning Ke any chance to retreat. Ning Ke looked at the yellow leaves that were struggling and cowering in the corner and asked, "Please enlighten me." Xiahou looked at him expressionlessly and said, "You can't touch me." Ning Ke turned to look at him and said, "But you dare not touch me either." Being unable to move and not daring to move, it sounded like there was no difference between the 2, but in fact there was a big difference. The former meant that Ning Ke did not have the ability, and the latter meant that Xiahou did not have the courage. Xiahou said, "Because of this, even if it can't be resolved, it has to be resolved. Or maybe you can wait for another 20 years, until I really become old and weak. At that time you must be dying and have enjoyed 20 years of peace." Ning Ke looked at him and said with a smile, "Of course, I'm just stating the facts. Don't misunderstand me, General. In fact, I think that since you are going to retire soon, you shouldn't say these inauspicious words." Hearing the word retire, Xiahou slightly narrowed his eyes, and an indifferent expression appeared on his dark face. He said, "Whether it is the imperial court or the West Hill, they all think that I can retire safely, so I should be very satisfied. In fact, I am not satisfied. The tens of thousands of cavalries under my command are enough to sweep away all the countries. I have made countless contributions for the Tang Empire and the West Hill, but the imperial court and His Majesty have always looked at me coldly because of those small things. If not, why would I go to the wilderness to snatch the tomes of arcane? Why would there be the current situation?" Ninkei asked, "General, are you explaining to me?" Xiahou did not hide his disdain for him and said mockingly, "If you were not lucky enough to become a disciple of the headmaster of the academy, what qualifications do you have to sit in front of me? Even so, what qualifications do you have for me to explain to you? I just want you to know that I am not in a good mood right now." Ninkei said, "In your previous words you described the bloody storm in Chang, and in the massacre in the Yan territory as small things. This made me not in a good mood." At this point in the conversation, someone finally pointed out what happened in the past. "I don't need to care about your mood." Xiahou looked at him coldly and said, "Because as I said before, you can't touch me. And if I'm in a bad mood you have to care. Because if you really make me angry, I can crush you like an ant. So I advise you to make me feel better in the days before I leave Chang and—" Ninkei shook his head and said, "I can't imagine how you can crush me. For example, at this moment in this autumn garden." Xiahou said expressionlessly, "Mr. 13 of the academy tried to assassinate the general of the empire, but failed miserably and was smashed into meat paste by me." Ninkei took a sip of the slightly astringent tea and smiled bitterly. "Crush me? General, you and the general's mansion, as well as the clansmen and relatives you sent back to your hometown, will also be crushed by my teacher." In the Tang Empire, the person who could really make Xiahou silent out of fear and not dare to do anything rash was never the emperor, but the headmaster of the academy in the back of the mountain. Xiahou looked at him and said indifferently, "As I said before, I dare not touch you and you can't touch me. So the position of host and guest is in my hands. In the days before I leave Chang, and if you really want to do something that I can't tolerate, then I will try to touch you." Ninkei asked seriously, "Is this a threat?" Xiahou said, "I am teaching you that any background and backing is meaningless. In the face of real life and death, only your own strength is worthy of trust." Ninkei looked at him and laughed. He said, "Back then, my youngest uncle defeated the devil's doctrine with one sword. General found that your background and backing had all disappeared. So you betrayed your sect and joined the West Hill? But my situation is different. The headmaster of the academy is not Lotus, and the academy is not the devil's doctrine. General, you can rest assured." This sentence directly uncovered the deepest secrets in Xiahou's heart. It could be said to be the most naked slap in the face, so General Xiahou's face turned scarlet. Not every time he blushed it was because he was drunk. Tonight he was drinking tea. General Xiahou's face turned red because he was angry. Ninkei dared to mock him like this, naturally because he was sure that even if the other party was the great general of the army, no matter how violent and bloodthirsty he was, he would not dare to do anything to him, who came from the academy. Sure enough, Xiahou looked at him quietly, as if he was looking at a withered leaf on the table. The scarlet color on his face gradually disappeared, and his emotions gradually calmed down. He said, "See the guest out." Ninkei gently shook off a leaf that had fallen on his black academy uniform. He did not bid farewell to Xiahou, who was sitting across the long table. He stood up and left the autumn garden. The autumn wind in the garden gradually calmed, and the pile of yellow leaves that had been blown to the corner gradually dispersed. The two Xiahou masters walked back into the garden and looked at their silent father. They wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "Nothing," Xiahou said expressionlessly. "A person who does not even dare to admit his own identity in front of the enemy who killed his father may be very smart, calm and rational, but these qualities are meaningless. Standing across the table, but not daring to take revenge for the family, it is a great humiliation. He knows this very well, so he felt humiliated and used words to humiliate me. Is he trying to seek psychological comfort through this? He only knows how to talk, but he does not know how to fight. A person who lacks the most basic courage to become a powerhouse is not worthy to be my enemy. General Xiaoho's invitation to Ning Ke was definitely the most important thing in Chang, and that day, when Ning Ke walked into the general's mansion, many bigwigs began to feel anxious and nervous. There were many spies hidden outside the general's mansion, and they continuously transmitted the situation of the banquet back to the palace or other places. No one knew the specific situation of the banquet in the general's mansion. But since Ning Ke walked out alive, it meant that nothing had happened at the banquet, because it meant that General Xiaoho did not take action. As for Ning Ke killing Xiaoho and walking out without any blood on his body, in everyone's eyes, this possibility did not exist. In the imperial study, His Majesty was deep in thought. In a hall not far away, the Empress and Grand Secretary Zheng Jing looked at each other with a slightly peaceful expression. General Su Shi, who had been in charge of the military ministry, nodded after hearing the news. But the old minister of offerings from Qinghe County who lived in the censor's mansion could not help but feel a little regretful. On the top floor of the Wanyan Tower, the nation master of Tang, Li Qingshan, stood by the stone window and looked in the direction of the general's mansion. He said with relief, "I have always been worried about Ning Ke's temperament. Now it seems that after studying with the headmaster of the academy for such a long time, he is much more sensible than before." Senior brother Yan Sei did not hand over his mantle, and the array eyed to him in vain. Master Huang Yang looked at him and smiled slightly, saying nothing. Li Qingshan left the side of the tower and walked back to the table. He pushed the Buddhist scriptures aside, took out a few black and white chess pieces from his arms, and casually threw them on the table. He had not recovered from his injury, but when he was in a good mood, he wanted to do something. This divination was completely random, and he did not want to peep into the mysteries of heaven. He just wanted to see if he could be lucky enough to get any response. A pure white chess piece suddenly spun, and it spun faster and faster until it finally spun out of the table and landed on the hard floor. With a crisp crack, the white chess piece split into two halves. The crack was smooth and traceless, as if it had been cut by a sharp sword. Li Qingshan stared at the white chess piece, and his expression gradually became serious. Huang Yang suddenly frowned and said in shock, "What a terrible sword. Did Lu Bai come to Chang'an? You also know that the first big note of the story, Nightfall, is about to arrive. We need to be careful and careful. We need to build up momentum before we can unleash it. This note is not only about the destined battle with Xiaoho. More importantly, this big plot needs to set the tone or temperament of the whole book in Ningquebec. I am very confident that we can do this job well together. See you tomorrow." No, tomorrow is a Saturday off. See you all the day after tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 459. The autumn wind blew into the tower and Chang'an knew no sorrow. The autumn grain from various counties was transported to the city one after another. The good harvest not only smoothed out the wrinkles on the faces of the rural farmers, but also brought smiles to the faces of the people in the city. Ginkgo leaves fell from the branches and covered the long street. It did not look solemn but elegant. Like in other seasons, many tourists from other counties and even foreign countries came to Chang, and with the autumn grain. Among them was a man in a light white robe. There was some dust on the man's robe, and he carried a long sword on his back. His expression was calm and gentle. Only a few people could understand the pride and indifference hidden in the depths of his eyes. He walked on the crowded streets of Chang'an. Although there were crowds of people in front of him, he only saw the historical buildings of Chang, and that had experienced thousands of years of wind and frost. There were no people in his eyes. This was the most prosperous and bustling city in the world, Chang'an. However, this man in a light white robe did not seem to feel the liveliness here. To be more precise, although his body was in the bustling mortal world, his spirit was not in this world, but in the smell of this city. Over the years, whether he was in the mortal world or outside the mortal world, that was where his body was, but his heart had been wandering outside the mortal world. Therefore there was no prosperity in his eyes, not even people. A few naughty children ran past the man with frosted fruit sticks in their hands. One of the crying little girls almost wiped her tears on his body. He frowned slightly as he looked at the little girl's back and slowly shook his head. A moment ago, he looked at the empty street and sensed the historical aura of this 1,000-year-old city. He was just about to recite a verse, but he was disturbed by these naughty children, so he immediately lost interest. Standing in front of the stall, he watched the short boss skillfully string all kinds of fruits together, and then roll them in the sugar paddle pot. Suddenly, he felt that it was pointless and walked towards the north of the city. At the top of the Wanyan Tower, Li Qingshan looked at the white chess piece that had been inexplicably split in two. He looked at the extremely smooth section of the chess piece, and his expression was solemn and complicated. There was a touch of confusion and emotion hidden in the shock. "You actually came to Chang'an? It seems that the situation is getting more and more troublesome." Huang Yang frowned and asked, "Is it really Lu Bai, the sword saint?" Li Qingshan shook his head and sighed gently. "It's not Lu Bai, but someone even more troublesome than Lu Bai." Huang Yang was slightly startled. "Is there someone more troublesome than Lu Bai?" "Yes," said Li Qingshan. Then he looked at Huang Yang and said with a serious expression, "I must leave to welcome that person. In the following days, if that person does not leave Chang'an, you must stay in the palace." Hearing this, Huang Yang remained silent and prepared to enter the palace. Li Qingshan's meaning was very clear. The expert who came to Chang'an city had the terrifying power to directly threaten His Majesty in the imperial palace. They even needed to work together to ensure His Majesty's safety. Therefore, when he went to meet the expert, Huang Yang had to stay in the palace and stay there forever. How many people in the world could pose a threat to the Tang Emperor in Chang'an? Just a few of them. The southern gate temple of Haotian was in the north city, very close to the imperial palace. Li Qingshan stood at the gate of the Taoist temple and looked at the vermilion palace wall and turret not far away. He was silent. No one could tell that he was extremely depressed and anxious at this time. The man in a light white robe walked slowly from the other end of the long street, accompanied by the autumn wind and fallen leaves. His clothes were ordinary, and only a simple Taoist bun indicated his origin. Li Qingshan looked at him and bowed calmly. "Greetings, Mr. Yisu." The man was the world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism, Yisu. Yisu looked calm and bowed back. "Greetings, Zhenren Li." His way of addressing Li Qingshan was very interesting. He did not call him Nation Master or Great Divine Priest, but Zhenren Li. This was a very Taoist title. In history, the Abbey Dean of the Southern Gate Temple of Haotian Taoism often served as the Nation Master of Tang. His position in the West Hill Divine Palace was similar to that of the three great divine priests on Peach Mountain. Although Yisu was unknown in the Divine Hall as a world wayfarer, his position in Haotian Taoism was extremely special. He was qualified to be on equal footing with the three great divine priests of West Hill. When Li Qingshan was conferred the title of Great Divine Priest, he had been to the Jishou Abbey. It was the only time he had been to the Jishou Abbey. He knew that the simple and even shabby Taoist temple was the real spirit of Haotian Taoism. Therefore, facing the person from the Jishou Abbey in front of him, he could not help but be vigilant. The man in front of him with a simple Taoist bun and a sword on his back was not an ordinary person. He was the legendary Yisu, the most powerful person in the younger generation of Haotian Taoism. His state was no less than that of the three great divine priests of the Divine Hall. There were even rumors that this person's state was slightly on the same level as Lu Bai's. As the Nation Master of Tang, Li Qingshan had already reached the highest peak of Haotian Taoism in the secular world. Yisu's identity and strength did not shock him. What really shocked and worried him was that rumor had it that Yisu would never set foot in the secular world. Why would he come to Chang'an and appear in front of the world? Fortunately, this person came to the Southern Gate Temple to meet him as soon as he entered Chang'an. Through this, Li Qingshan felt that the other party wanted to express his wish and was slightly relieved. "I heard that the Tang Empire is very strict with the management of cultivators. Foreign cultivators have to register at the Imperial Center Administration when they enter Chang'an. I don't want to deal with those ordinary people, so I would like to trouble you to help me," Yi Su said calmly. Hearing this, Li Qingshan was slightly stunned. The law of the Tang Empire did stipulate that foreign cultivators had to register at the Imperial Center Administration when they entered Chang'an. Otherwise, they would be regarded as enemies by the Imperial Court of the Tang Empire. However, no matter how strict the law was, it still depended on who it was. It could only restrict those who could be restricted. How could it affect people like Yi Su? However, Yi Su did not seem to understand this. The first thing he did after coming to Chang and was to ask the southern gate of Haotian to help him register. It sounded interesting, but there were some hidden meanings. Li Qingshan understood what he meant and said with a smile, "I dare not disobey." The Taoists of the Southern Gate Temple would naturally handle such a trivial matter as registering at the Imperial Center Administration. Li Qingshan invited Yi Su into the temple to drink tea and wanted to find out the other party's intention. Yi Su said, "I just came to Chang and to travel. I don't want to alarm too many people or cause any misunderstanding. I will just stroll around in the next few days." After saying this, he turned around and left the Southern Gate Temple, walking towards the Vermilion Bird Avenue. On the long street in autumn, Yi Su's figure became fainter and fainter, as if he was about to melt into the autumn leaves. Li Qingshan looked at that place and frowned slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. That man came from the untouchable place. That man was a world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism. Although he said he did not want to alarm too many people, such a terrifying person strolling around in Chang and was bound to alarm too many people. From today onwards, Chang'an was rarely peaceful. After leaving the Southern Gate Temple and walking on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, Yi Su followed the direction of the rolling leaves all the way to the south. Not long after, he arrived at the famous Vermilion Bird stone painting. He looked at the vivid vermilion bird painting on the ground and felt the hidden aura within it. He was silent for a long time. Even though he was in a high state, he could not help but admire the predecessor who built Chang, and 1,000 years ago and turned this magnificent city into a god-stunning array. Then he continued walking. Just as he said to Li Qingshan, he walked without any purpose. He walked completely according to his heart. He followed the hawkers, passed through the streets and alleys, looked at the kites and walked casually. When he was a little thirsty, he would borrow a ladle of water from the well at the entrance of the alley. He did not stop walking. In a very quiet street he saw a simple Taoist temple. At the entrance of the Taoist temple, a Taoist priest was preaching the West Hill scriptures to the people. More than a dozen neighbors carried small stools and sat there listening attentively. From time to time, someone would raise their hand to ask about something they did not understand in the scriptures. Yi Su stood outside the crowd and listened quietly to the preaching of the doctrine. He felt that it was different from the preaching he had heard in other places in the world. Especially the questions and even doubts from the people who were listening from time to time made him feel very uncomfortable. He even felt a little disgusted and angry. A middle-aged man noticed him standing behind him. He saw that he was a little unfamiliar and thought that he was a tourist from another county. He stood up with great enthusiasm and invited him to sit down and listen. Yi Su was not used to the innate enthusiasm of the people of Chang, and, after a slight pause, he shook his head and declined. He looked expressionlessly at the Taoist priest who was stuttering on the stone steps. He watched as the Taoist priest stuttered in front of the people's harmless questions. His expression became a little ugly. To Yi Su, Haotian Taoism was his home and country. Even if the Southern Gate Temple was independent of the West Hill Divine Palace, it was still his place. That was why he went to see Li Qingshan as soon as he entered Chang'an. That was why when he traveled around the world, he would often hide his identity and visit various Taoist temples. In the Taoist temples of other countries, some Taoist priests might be greedy and stupid, but at least Haotian Taoism enjoyed supreme respect and glory. He had never seen a follower dare to ask a Taoist priest questions. He could not imagine that a follower would dare to doubt the records in the scriptures. Since he was a follower of Haotian, he should obey the scriptures and not doubt them. No matter whether the doubt was reasonable or not, as long as he began to doubt it, It would be blasphemy. This was Yisu's opinion. A voice sounded beside him. What's your opinion? The speaker was a scholar in an old coat. The scholar's eyes were unusually clean and he had a water ladle tied to his waist. He did not hold the old book in his hand today. Yisu looked at the scholar and was silent for a long time. Then he said, "This is Chang. My opinion is not as important as yours." This scholar was naturally the eldest brother of the academy. The eldest brother smiled and said, "If I remember correctly, this should be your first time in Chang'an. Since you are here, you should stay for a few more days. Perhaps you will have a different opinion after seeing more." Yisu said, "I hope so too. 2 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 460. The Taoist priest on the stone steps gradually controlled the atmosphere and did not let the questions continue. He waved his arms and kept spitting saliva, reciting the profound words in the scriptures. His expression was sometimes solemn, sometimes passionate, sometimes compassionate, and sometimes stern. The dozen neighbors who were listening to him were very focused. Their bodies leaned forward and backward from time to time. They could not help covering their mouths and listening to the Haotian miracles that had been discovered somewhere. They could not help but feel sympathy and yearning for the martyrs. No one noticed the existence of eldest brother and Yisu. Although they were the greatest figures in the academy in Haotian Taoism, there was nothing special about them on the surface. After a brief conversation, the two formally greeted each other. Yisu stood with one hand in front of his chest and the other clenched fist against the edge of his palm. He looked calm and slightly lowered his head, saying, "Greetings, Mr. First." Eldest brother kept his composure and returned the greeting seriously. "Greetings, Mr. Yi." Yisu said, "I thought Mr. Second would be the first to appear." Eldest brother smiled and said, "My teacher was worried that Junemo would come and destroy Chang and city, so he imprisoned him in the back mountain." Hearing the word teacher, Yisu thought of the headmaster of the academy who was admired by countless people in the cultivation world. After a moment of silence, he said seriously, "I wonder if I have the chance to meet the headmaster of the academy?" Eldest brother said, "I will ask my teacher." Yisu said, "Thank you, Mr. First." Eldest brother looked into his eyes and suddenly asked, "Are you here to see Chang'an or Xiaohou?" Yisu said, "Xiaohou is an elder of the Divine Hall after all, and it was my teacher who personally led him to the Divine Hall. He has done a great service to Haotian Taoism. Although he once had some delusions in the wilderness, it does not make up for his contributions. Haotian Taoism hopes to see him have a good ending. I think the Tang Emperor and his ministers also do not want to see a dog being cooked." Eldest brother said gently, "There is no such thing in the academy. Contributions are contributions and mistakes are mistakes. One must bear the responsibility. However, since General Xiaohou is willing to return peacefully, I think no one will stop him. Moreover, he is a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts. Who can stop him?" Yisu said, "Xiaohou is old, and he was seriously injured by the Tang. I know this, and I think the headmaster and Mr. First should be even more aware of it. If he was still the Xiaohou of the past, why would my master send a message for me to come to Chang and to take a look? Or is it that Mr. First doesn't welcome me?" Eldest brother said, "The Tang Empire is an open-minded country. Chang'an welcomes anyone." Yisu looked at the commoner who gave up his stool to him and said, "The Tang Empire is indeed different from other countries. The main thing is the atmosphere." Eldest brother smiled and said, "I hope you can enjoy your stay in Chang'an." "Not very pleasant," said Yisu. If an ordinary tourist met a black-hearted shopkeeper in Chang'an or ate an extremely expensive vegetarian meal in Wanyan Tower Temple, he might be very unhappy, but it would not have any impact on the world. Yisu had just arrived in Chang'an, and his unhappiness seemed unreasonable. However, he was a world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism, and his unhappiness might bring some unhappiness to Chang'an. Hearing him say that he was unhappy, even eldest brother's expression gradually became solemn. He asked seriously, "What's the matter?" Yisu looked at the Taoist priest on the stone steps of the Taoist temple and said, "This place is not pleasant." Eldest brother turned around and silently listened to the Taoist priest's preaching for a while. After listening to the neighbor's questions, he roughly understood where Yisu's unhappiness came from. For thousands of years, the Jishou Abbey had always been very dissatisfied with the preaching of Haotian Taoism in the Tang Empire. However, these things were handled by the South School of Haotian Taoism, especially since the Tang Empire had the Academy and the Iron Cavalry. Therefore, the West Hill Divine Palace had never been able to make a deeper impact. However, when a proud son of Haotian like Yisu suddenly heard a discussion in a remote alley of Chang, and that was completely different from the rest of the world, he was naturally unhappy. Eldest brother said, "Believing in Haotian doesn't mean believing in Haotian Taoism, and it doesn't mean that you can't raise your own questions about the teachings of the West Hill Divine Palace." Yisu quietly looked at the scholar in front of him. He had seen him by the Hulun Sea, but it was not a chance for them to have a long and peaceful conversation on the city wall of Chang, unlike today. Therefore he looked carefully and seriously, trying to understand why this person could sit on the other side of the line. He thought he had already understood some parts. "What about you people from the academy?" Yisu looked at eldest brother's eyes and said calmly, "I can understand you. I know that you don't even believe in Haotian, so do you think that you can even doubt Haotian?" Eldest brother smiled slightly and did not deny or defend himself. Yisu also smiled. His smile seemed indifferent and cold. He said, "There is indeed a group of terrible people living in the academy. You should not exist at all." Eldest brother sincerely asked, "Why do you say so?" Yisu looked into his eyes and said in a low and cold voice, "There is no reverence if there is no faith. Those who do not know reverence will naturally not care about the torrential flood." Mr. Ku was like that back then. Will the next generation of the academy be like that? Then who will it fall on? You or Mr. Second or that guy Ning K? Eldest brother looked at him and said calmly, "The academy only teaches us the truth, not the faith. In fact, among my younger brothers and younger sisters, there are a few devout Haotian believers. However, we believe in another saying. Being able to have no faith is actually a kind of faith. Not having faith was actually a kind of faith." Yisu frowned slightly and repeated this sentence in his heart. He seemed to be thinking about something. Eldest brother said, "If one day in the future you can agree or even just respect our faith, then you will actually have the same faith." Yisu looked up at the sky. The branches of the yellow leaf trees on the street in autumn cut the sky above their heads, but they could not stop the clear sunlight from shining down from the vault of heaven and then shining on everything. Haotian's divine light shines on the world. When it falls on the flowers bloom. When it falls on the trees sprout. When it falls on the fields there are ears of grain. Flowers can entertain the eyes, trees can provide shade, and ears of grain can make people live. Then they wither and fall into the dust, turning into nutrients to nourish the earth, and the earth regenerates everything. Yisu looked at the autumn sunlight that leaked through the branches, and his eyes gradually emitted a faint luster. He said calmly and firmly, "Everything in the world originates from Haotian. Haotian has given everything to human beings, including life. And the dignity and freedom of civilization are attached to life. Therefore, faith in Haotian is not faith but the way the world should operate." Eldest brother imitated him and looked up at the sky. His eyes fell on the clear autumn sky, but he did not have the same feelings as Ning Quebec. He only felt that the sun was a little too strong today, and the air in Chang'an was not good recently. He wondered which iron furnace workshop was violating the rules again. Yisu withdrew his gaze from the sky and noticed that the scholar beside him was obviously distracted. He could not help but feel a little unhappy. Eldest brother felt his gaze and rubbed his eyes awkwardly. Then he said seriously, "The academy has never wanted to deny that Haotian has given everything to the world, but this does not mean that everything in the world belongs to Haotian." Yisu said, "You are twisting the truth." Eldest brother said, "Just like our parents gave us flesh and life, it does not mean that everything we have belongs to our parents. Because we learn the way of learning from our teachers, the way of getting along with our companions, and the way of nature from the fields. These acquired things are our own. Yisu asked, "What about the headmaster?" For the disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy, the headmaster was their faith. Yisu's question seemed very simple, but in fact it was the most difficult one to answer. Eldest brother thought about filial piety for a moment and said, "The headmaster once said that human beings should respect their teachers, but they should also respect reason. If the headmaster is wrong, we, as his students, should certainly point out his mistakes. This is the true way of a disciple, and it is also the way of faith in my opinion." Yisu looked at him and asked sarcastically, "May I ask, Mr. First has studied under the headmaster for many years. Have you ever seen the headmaster make mistakes, and how many times have you pointed out his mistakes?" Eldest brother could not help but be speechless. He thought that among all the disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy, only Junyan had dared to speak out against the headmaster. In the past 6 months, youngest brother seemed to have been this brave, but only he had not pointed out any mistakes of the headmaster. He did not feel ashamed because in his view, the headmaster was indeed a perfect person without any shortcomings. But he was very clear that Yisu would definitely think that his statement was absurd. Looking at his embarrassed expression, Yisu sneered and felt indescribably happy. He thought that even if you were on the side and I was on the side, there were still times when you were not as good as me. Eldest brother suddenly thought of something, and his eyes suddenly brightened. He clapped his hands and said happily, "For years ago, the headmaster put an extra spoonful of soy sauce when he was cooking braised pork. I pointed it out on the spot." Yisu was startled and asked coldly, "Can that be counted?" Eldest brother said seriously, "Of course it can be counted." Yisu's eyebrows twitched slightly, and his emotions reached the critical point of exploding. Since many years ago, he had always regarded the scholar beside him as a goal to pursue, and thought that he was a very respectable opponent. But he did not expect that after getting to know him, he found that he did not have any demeanor of a master at all, and was no different from those poor scholars who failed to pass the examinations. Eldest brother noticed that the sword style in Yisu's eyes was getting brighter and brighter, and could not help but feel helpless, thinking that he was indeed not good at fighting. "The truth is not clear without debate," eldest brother said. "Since we have different ideas, why don't we listen to the opinions of these ordinary people?" Yisu looked at the Chong and citizens who were sitting in their chairs, leaning back and forth and looking relaxed. He frowned and said, "Since when does a goshawk need to care about the opinions of ants?" Eldest brother shook his head and said, "In fact, we did not fly that high." Yisu thought for a moment, and then walked into the crowd. Eldest senior brother smiled faintly and followed. "There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 461. The eldest brother and Yisu walked to the stone steps and whispered to the Taoist. The Taoist was a little surprised and unhappy, especially when he clenched his right fist in his sleeve and waited for a long time without receiving any money. He was even more dissatisfied. However, when he looked at the Taoist bun on Yisu's head, the Taoist found that he had lost all courage to stop them and could only remain silent. The dozen or so neighbors who came to the small Taoist temple to listen to the preaching of the scriptures were immersed in the historical story told by the Taoist. They occasionally questioned but still listened with great interest. At this time, they suddenly found that the preaching was interrupted and 2 people stood in front of the Taoist. They could not help but be surprised. Yisu's face was expressionless. For him, if it was not for the ideological battle with Mr. First of the Academy, he had no interest in talking to these ordinary people in this chaotic world. Next, I will explain the essence of the 3 essentials of Haotian Taoism. Then he looked at the eldest brother and said, "Mr. First is welcome to ask any questions." The eldest brother nodded calmly. Yisu began to talk about his understanding of Haotian Taoism. The eldest brother occasionally raised his doubts. One was the world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism, and the successor of the Jisho Abbey. He studied the scriptures of Hautian Taoism since he was a child and later traveled to many countries. He broke through the barrier of life and death and had a deep understanding of morality. He was the most outstanding person in the world. The other was Mr. First of the Academy, the first disciple of the headmaster of the Academy. He was well versed in the 6 arts and had followed the headmaster of the Academy to travel around the world. His state was unfathomable. Although his words and actions were slow, he was the most intelligent person. At this moment, they were debating with each other in front of the crowd. Naturally, the two of them weren't as calm and direct as they were when they were talking in private. Both of them looked for evidence from the ancient books and notes of famous experts, and they looked for comrades. Their words were brief but not comprehensive, and then they became profound. Every word they said contained an extremely deep meaning. No matter how one looked at it, the debate between Mr. First of the Academy and Yi Su, the successor of the Jisho Abbey, was undoubtedly a legendary event that was destined to be recorded in history. If the people of the cultivation world were to find out about this, they would definitely be shocked to the extreme. In order to be able to participate in such a grand event, to be able to hear the voices of these two experts that were only above the clouds, even if they were on the verge of death, they would still call for their disciples to carry them over on stretchers to listen respectfully. However, this debate did not take place in the Lang Temple, the West Hill Divine Palace, or the Academy. It took place in a remote alley in Chang'an, in front of an inconspicuous Taoist temple. The people gathered in front of the Taoist temple were just the most ordinary people. They did not know that the two people standing on the stone steps were unworldly masters who occasionally stepped into the mortal world. Their status was as noble as an emperor. These people had read books, but they had not read the classics hidden in the Academy and the Jisho Abbey. They could not understand the profound meaning hidden in the debate between the two men. They were just ordinary people who worked every day to earn money and then drank, chatted, and played. In their opinion, the story told by the Taoists was much more interesting than the words of the two men who quarreled for no reason. What are they talking about? Who knows? Anyway, I don't understand. Why did the skinny Taoist let them speak? Who knows? The two of them are not interesting at all. Let's go. Didn't the skinny Taoist say that we can take a jar of wine home after the lecture? If we leave now, can we still take it? If we can't take it, why should we waste so much time here? I really can't listen anymore. What the hell is this? I'm going to fall asleep if we don't leave. Don't mention that jar of wine to me. I'd rather not drink it than continue to listen. That's true. Then let's go. The debate in front of the small Taoist temple, that could make the entire cultivation world go crazy, did not attract the attention of ordinary people at all. The people under the stone steps discussed and were extremely annoyed. Then they gradually dispersed. The debate on the stone steps had entered the most critical moment. The eldest brother and Yi Su frowned and thought hard. They were extremely careful with every word they said. They did not notice what was happening around them at all. After an unknown period of time, when they came to their senses, they found that the front of the Taoist temple had become extremely quiet. The people from before had disappeared. The autumn wind blew the fallen leaves, and the autumn leaves crushed the alley. Only the cold and awkward atmosphere accompanied the two. The skinny Taoist looked at the two of them and sighed helplessly. He said, I bought more than 20 jars of wine to gather so many believers to listen to the lecture. In the end, they were all driven away by you. I really don't understand. What are you doing here? Are you here to cause trouble? The eldest brother was a little embarrassed. Yi Su was a little angry. After a long silence, he said, If you think that the incense money is too little, I'll stay. I'll earn enough incense money for you. The Taoist looked at the Taoist bun on his head and could not say anything to refuse. He just wanted to cry in his heart and thought, Are you going to destroy this small Taoist temple of yours? The eldest brother looked at Yi Su and said with a bitter smile, It seems that the so-called struggle of ideas is meaningless. Because if you are always floating in the clouds, how can you land? I don't have a residence in Chang'an City, so I'll stay in this Taoist temple for the time being. Yi Su looked into his eyes and said straightforwardly, I came to Chong and City not only to see Xiaoho, but also because of that matter. I heard from my master that you had been sitting on the other side of the black line 15 years ago. Since you also experienced it, in your opinion, is that youngest brother of yours the one? The eldest brother smiled slightly and did not answer the question. He turned around and left the small Taoist temple. Walking out of the general's mansion, Ning Ke noticed the spies who were hiding in the streets but did not deliberately cover their tracks. He knew that many bigwigs in the imperial court were concerned about the story between him and Xiaoho. After a moment of silence, he walked down the stone steps and gently patted the big black horse's head. During this period of time, he had many things to do and needed a more convenient means of transportation. The iron horse carriage left by his teacher Yen Sei could not be as light as a feather because his state was not high enough. An ordinary horse could not pull it at all, so he brought the big black horse out from the back of the mountain of the academy. The big black horse obviously did not feel proud and moved because the carriage behind it was too heavy. Compared to this, it would rather continue to be bullied by the wooden fish in the academy. The completely black horse carriage drove to the Yanming Lake. Ning Ke sat in the carriage, leaning against the back of the carriage and resting with his eyes closed. He looked a little tired. Earlier in the autumn garden of the general's estate, he'd sat across from Xiaoho and discussed the Tao. They'd talked about the stories of the past, and the gratitude and grudges between them. Even though they hadn't made it clear, it had tempered and tested his mind. There was a faint fragrance of osmanthus outside the carriage window. He thought that it was the osmanthus in the He family's mansion, and it had actually bloomed at this time. At this moment, something in his arms suddenly warmed up. The heat spread through the black academy uniform into the air in the carriage, making the fragrance of the osmanthus even stronger. Ning Ke opened his eyes and reached into his arms to take out the array pestle tightly wrapped in cloth. He felt the clear heat coming from his palms and slowly raised his eyebrows with a solemn expression. After entering the palace to study and meditate, he now had a deep understanding of the big tactical array of Chong and City. Although he was still far from the state and means of his master Yen Sei, his mind had gradually connected with Chong and City, and he could perceive everything this magnificent city wanted to tell him. Ning Ke sensed that a peerless powerhouse had entered Chong, and at this moment it was the moment when Yisu entered Chong, and with the grain team from other counties. Ning Ke did not know that the powerhouse who had come to Chong, and was Yisu. He only knew that the other party was very strong. So strong that the array pestle began to slightly heat up. He could not help but have a very strong sense of vigilance in his eyes. He said to the black horse in front of the carriage, "Turn around and go to the academy." Ning Ke turned to the academy because he was very clear that with his state and strength, he could not deal with the powerhouse who had come to Chang'an. In addition, in fact, he also used this as an excuse to ask his teacher some questions. Some questions that the academy had never discussed but had always been like firewood in his heart. After entering the back of the mountain of the academy, Ning Ke heard the sound of the waterfall and came to the hut. Ning Ke did not see the headmaster. It was obvious that the headmaster did not want to answer his questions, so he did not want to see him. Then he left the hut, bypassed the waterfall and came to the precipice. He slowly walked along the steep stone path, hidden in the precipice, and returned to the cliff cave where he had lived for 3 months. The wisteria on the roofed corridor had long withered. The wisteria fruits were not stewed by Sang Sang, but became food for the ants on the ground. Standing on the edge of the cliff, Ning Ke looked at the sea of clouds in front of him and Chang, and on the other side of the sea of clouds. He was silent for a long time, analyzing the headmaster's attitude by avoiding to see him. After an unknown period of time, eldest brother walked to his side and looked at the distant Chong and City. He said, "The person who came is Yisu." Ning Ke had already felt that the person who entered Chong and City was a peerless powerhouse, so he was not surprised to hear Yisu's name. Eldest brother looked at him and suddenly said, "Everything in the past, such as yesterday's death." Ning Ke knew that eldest brother was trying to persuade him. He did not want to say anything, but when he looked at the distant Chong and City shrouded in the autumn sunshine, he suddenly had the idea to say something. "But I did not die yesterday. They all died." Between the precipice, the autumn wind blew and the clouds moved. The silver thread-like waterfalls between the precipice became thinner than in spring because of the decreasing water volume. Eldest brother looked at the waterfall between the precipice and said, "If a person is blinded by hatred, then he will not be able to see the wider world and the more beautiful scenery." Ninkei said, "Hatred cannot blind one's eyes. It can only make one's eyes red. For me, hatred has already become my eyes. All these years I have not seen anything else. Revenge is my world and my most beautiful scenery." Eldest brother said, "Is it really worth living such an uncomfortable life?" Ninkei turned to look at him and said, "Senior brother, you are wrong. If people want to live freely, they should not think too much. They should do whatever they want to do. That is true freedom." In this state of mind I still wrote it, speechlessly and bitterly. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.